paying attention to how things work.
So Joe Rogan, give him to me in one sentence.
Bald podcaster.
Have you ever tried DMT?
No.
That's Joe
That's Joe
Rogan's
Rogan.
one sentence.
Have you ever tried DMT?
We're live.
Demasculine traits. We're live like we're going, or we're live like you're testing things?
No, it's live. It's live.
Hello! We are live as it gets. Welcome, everyone. What camera do I look at? Which is the one that's operative?
That one.
Middle.
This one?
Middle.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Politics of Gender, the one where we wrap it up.
So many people were complaining about Mark's socks that he just decided not to wear any.
No socks.
So thank you for that comment.
Yeah, I mean, whatever. It got me in trouble with my wife, though, because someone was like, your wife needs to not let you out of the house with those socks. Which is, she's not a cop.
That's true.
She's got all sorts going on. Oh, and she asked me to say that if my shirt looks dirty, it's not her fault. That's my fault, because I wore this shirt to, move stuff today.
Okay. Well,
So we're good. Wife. And speaking of wives, gender.
gender.
So we've got all sorts of questions that have come in beforehand from the Discord and
Email,
Yep,
YouTube.
some YouTube
Kind of
comments.
everything all together.
So we did our best to stack them together, or rather Maria did her best. Sorry for appropriating
My work.
the work of women into the male work there. And some of them are really good. And what I like about the questions generally is that they're the kind of questions that, at least for me, I had subsequent to saying or thinking the kinds of things that we have been talking about. So it seems that we're all at least tracking with each other. I'm not saying we're going to be going all the way together, skipping down the merry road, but so far we seem to be on the same wavelength.
Yeah, it's the kind of questions that, we're all thinking on the same page and moving in similar directions. So thank you.
Okay. So, whether you're cis or trans or just here for the ride, we're going to begin. 3. No, let's do it.
Androgyny.
Yeah, so
That's
a
our
bunch of
first
questions
topic.
about androgyny. All very similar.
Should I just read the first one?
Why not? I'm sorry that we didn't put names on this. You know who you are if you're listening. Thank you for the questions.
That was my fault. Okay.
We can make it up. Kate from Kansas says.
Our faith requires that Jesus Christ has some connection to every man and woman in order for the redemption to be possible. Statements such as the one found somewhere in Romans, he who is rich became poor for our sake, so that by his poverty we might become rich. Or fathers, God became man, so that man might become God, seem to imply that what is primary in Christ is the androgynous homo as opposed to vir or mulier. St.
Which
Paul
is the
seems
male.
to suggest as much. So the Too Long Didn't Read is, where does gender fit into soteriology? Or, if Christ is going to save all of us, wouldn't it make more sense for Christ to take on androgynous human nature as opposed to coming as vir or man or mulier woman?
Yeah, and
That's
I
the
don't know if
question.
it's
It's a
here,
great
but
question.
I remember getting the question phrased with the patristic statement that which is not assumed is not redeemed. And so if God only assumes, if there are two distinct genders, and if God only assumes one of them in his becoming man, does that leave the female sex unredeemed? Wouldn't it be better to have a sort of God assuming in both male and female human nature itself, right? And I will at least start by affirming that the question is a good one.
Yeah. Yep.
And that at least for some of the Greek fathers, they actually went so far as to declare Jesus Christ a divine androgen. So, in the
and
end,
I think that's where some of the 19th century occultism was drawing on from, with the idea of the androgynous Adam, the androgynous Christ. They were going back and finding that idea elsewhere in Christianity.
yeah, and it's not something you see in the Latins, and I think this pairs well with a lot of Greek-Latin divides in the church generally. I mean, the Greek church more generally carried over a lot of the institutions, or at least the semblance of the institutions of paganism prior, including empires, eunuchs, emperors, obviously. And while the Latin West did a lot of that, they always were kind of bumpkins compared to the powerful East. So in the Latin Church, the emphasis has pretty much always been on Christ as male. A book recommendation here for those interested is called The Sexuality of Christ in Renaissance Art, I believe. It might be a longer title. But it basically shows that there's a whole theology of the maleness of Christ specifically, in opposition to the theology of the human nature of Christ, which gets a kind of exclusive focus elsewhere. Okay, to the question.
Right. So that is there somewhere in the tradition, and yeah, where do we go from there in answering that question?
I think it's wrong. I think Jesus is not an androgen.
Mm-hmm.
And we all know this because he was circumcised.
Yeah.
But there's also just the fact that what is really being asked is a question about human nature. What is human nature? Now, for many people, and I think this comes with a bad reading of Aquinas that is pervasive within the Catholic intellectual world, they have an idea that human nature is identical vis-a-vis of individual humans as something like cat, dog, or chicken nature is to individual cats, dogs, and chickens.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this is not true. I think there's something very special about human nature where it can't quite be described in that same way. So maybe this will be clarifying to begin in this sense, that I think that if chickens needed to be saved, then Jesus as the chicken savior could have done what is suggested here, right? He could have become an androgen. Why? Because I think that within the animal species who are created according to their kind, what properly exists and what has a certain eternity to it is the species itself. Male and female are modifications of this primary species for the sake of its reproduction. And you can see this within animal life. Animals always do sort of the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Change and difference doesn't occur really on the level of the individual animal as much as over time. The sort of evolution of a species over time is where you see change happening. Whereas man is not like that. Man is free and rational and open to the infinite. Okay. So the way that God makes man is distinct, and I believe that it's to show this fundamental difference. So in the Genesis account, animals alone are created according to their kind. When he comes to man, he creates a male, and then he creates a female. In what Aquinas refers to as two distinct acts of divine power,
Mm-hmm.
and from two predeterminate materials. So Eve from the rib of Adam, Adam from the dust of the earth. Okay, so there's a emphasis on the distinction that's it's obviously different from the way that the animals are created, in which it's just the birds are created of the air, the beasts are created of the earth, the fish are created of the sea, and the
Right.
differentiation is of that fundamental sameness. That sea becoming fish is, you could reduce the animals to that sea, like that's their primary stuff out of which they are made.
So not only is there a difference in the timing, like the two
Yeah.
different acts, but the stuff by which they were made is different.
Yeah.
And yeah, that seems to be very much on purpose to emphasize the gender
Right.
of
So then the
man and
question
woman.
becomes, what is human nature and why is it described this way? Like, all the fathers agree that when you're reading Genesis, everything is in the order it's in to teach us something. Like the language of
Mhm.
Scripture is for the sake of the education of the church. So what are we being taught to believe? How are we being taught to think about the human person? Well, it seems to me that the answer is something like this. The human species is not simply the divine idea of the human instantiated in individuals. Okay? Because it comes from two distinct acts of creation, the human species is better referred to as that unity between the original man and woman and the family that results. What I mean is this. It's not the case Well, okay, so when man is created, he's created differently. And it shows us that um, the species unity is more akin to a family unity. So it's a real person, Adam, and a real person, Eve, who create a real family that they call the human family. And it's historical. Okay, so it's not just this, it's moving through time, it's moving through space. And what we are as a human species is deeply intertwined with our freedom to create worlds, to be a particular kind of being. And it's not simply governed by a divine idea as it is reproduced in time, if that makes sense.
I guess, or maybe a different way of putting it is that what it means to be human is not some like androgynous essence floating out in the ether.
Yeah.
Like that human doesn't exist. Part of what it means to be human means to be existing in time and to be coming from or united in a family. We see God like uniting the family in the beginning.
Yeah.
But there's no human that doesn't come from some kind of familial union after that.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of family aspect of the human person is important for understanding what it means for us to be saved, and salvation in general, just because salvation, when we look at the New Testament, it's always, it uses kind of this image of inheritance. And that's an idea that's specifically connected to families. So
Like the firstborn inherits the land, you mean?
yeah, so the way that we receive salvation is by becoming one with Christ, who is the one who inherits eternal life from the Father, is kind of the language that you see being used a lot.
Yeah. I mean, one way to look at it is to say, okay, let's say that it's true that whatever is not assumed is not redeemed. So Christ, in assuming human nature, irrespective of sex, in fact saves all of humanity. Well, this leads to kind of a curious idea, right? Which is, well, why didn't it work? Like, if all you had to do was become human to save humanity as such, why then do individual humans have to be saved? Why does it have to progress through history? What is the need of the church? What is the need of the actual going forth, making disciples of all nations, and turning people, converting people condemned to death into new life, freeing them from slavery? There's this vision sometimes within I don't think the patristics meant this. I just think it's a bad interpretation of what they're getting at, which is to take the kind of like to make of salvation a sort of math equation. It's like, well, he got human nature and he's without sin, therefore human nature has been redeemed, without asking the question of what is human nature. Because if it's something in particular, then you can't just say, well, he got it, so it's saved. You have to say, well, how is this nature saved?
Right.
And it seems to me what the historical evidence is the way that human nature is saved is by spreading, like salvation actually being given from human beings to other human beings. What does Christ do? He establishes the church. He gives people the power to forgive sins. He says, go out and preach the gospel to all the nations. And there's a acknowledgement, I think, that precisely the opposite of the kind of androgynous opinion here, which is that what human nature is makes it insufficient to merely assume the kind of thing that contains both male and female. Rather, actual males and females have to hear the gospel. This is important. So when Augustine, for instance, tackles this question, he says something really fascinating. He says that it was fitting for the Virgin Mary to be conceived without sin. I mean, he doesn't say those words exactly, but it's fitting for the Virgin Mary to be saved, to signify the salvation of the female sex. Right. So Christ signifies the salvation of the male sex in an obvious way. And Mary signifies the salvation of the female sex. Now, this is an argument of fittingness, okay? So it's important to realize there's certain limitations to that. What fittingness means is that it's proper to the mysteries being revealed that it was done this way. It doesn't mean it was necessary, right? But I wonder, and this is a theological opinion here. Or not even an opinion yet. This is sort of my wonder at Augustine's statement. I wonder whether it's merely fitting. right? Like, is it merely fitting that Mary is co-redemptrix? Is it merely fitting that she is the mother of God? In some ways, we have to say that for God to become man, I mean, Paul talks about this all the time. When he describes the incarnation, he always says things like born of a woman, born under the law. In some ways, it's necessary to become man, to become sexed, right? So you can't become the general man because there is no such thing as an individuated general man. Like, you are always man as male or man as female. So there's this sort of necessity. And in the same way as you're describing, like, to become man in this, like, within history, within our story, within the world as it is,
In order
means
to
to
become
be
one of us, he needs woman.
right. If he's going to be born under the law, he has to be born into a family under the law. He has to be given the law. There is a, I mean, it's just supremely beautiful to think of salvation being fundamentally affected through a holy family. Now, you have to be careful because there's a Christological priority here, which is to say that this is not to say that, like, salvation comes a little bit from Mary, who gives it to the women, and then it comes a little bit from Christ, who gives it to the men. Like, that's completely false. Like, Christ alone.
I mean, I think
his death and resurrection is the source of our salvation.
I guess the way the mental image that's coming to mind for me is like a cup that's overflowing. So like Christ is pouring out his salvation, and it's overflowing into Mary, who overflows.
But in
into
some way,
others.
I hear you say, Mary, but I think in another way, it's like Mary must be the cup, because
Oh yeah.
I don't want to call Our Lady of the Cup. That seems a little bit much. But like, the point is that Christ could not become man except for
Yeah,
the
well,
way
I think
that men
maybe
become
cup,
men.
cup is perfect. Mary, Our Lady of the Cup. I mean, she is the vessel of God.
Yeah.
Like that's
Vessel
that
just
is
sounds nicer.
that is the image.
My 3-year-old has cups.
But I think this makes sense when we look back at Genesis 2, because when we like think about how things were supposed to play out in Catholic theology, the idea was that like the original man and woman were given this gift of like divine intimacy, this original grace that was meant to be passed on as an inheritance. So it's the image of the cup, God giving this unnecessary gift, and it overflows unto their children. They didn't earn this, they didn't deserve this, but that should have been the gift that was passed on. I mean, you could see it as like a pre-salvation salvation gift. That's how it was supposed to work from the beginning.
Sure, yes.
And so when we lost the gift and we're going to gain back the inheritance, it functions in the same way.
Yeah, totally.
It has the same pattern.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think... Yeah, I think once you recognize that human nature is a historical reality stemming from a real marriage, then the salvation of the female sex cannot... I just don't think, I'm really giving my opinion here, I do not think it could be adequately signified without Mary being saved. And one of the ways to think of this is just to think of the reverse and see if it's at all convincing. If God had simply become male up from the earth and had no mother, was not born under a woman, I mean, it literally seems impossible, because I don't think we would know him. Like when it said he is like unto us in all things but sin.
Be like, yeah, you're very much not like us.
But if we can imagine that, I do think there would be a sincere question about whether the female sex is saved if what came out of the earth was male. But because salvation comes precisely through a unified difference of a mother, a foster father, a holy family, quite literally, the first thing that's properly called holy in the New Testament, in the New Age, is a family through Christ, right? Through his death and resurrection. But that the story of evangelization, the story of spreading that salvation through time, is one of that family giving the gift of God to other families. And that, I think, is the kind of Catholic view of redemption. I think that this finds a difficulty for a Protestant or a Protestantized mind, where it's just not so clear why Mary is important. Like, Mary, kind of does what's necessary to get Jesus there, but doesn't have a sort of signifying value in herself. And I think that with this sort of wisdom from Augustine, that she signifies the salvation of the female sex, then we have a way of looking at why we don't think Jesus had to become an androgen. Because what was assumed was not simply assumed in like some kind of monad Christ, like individual sort of liberal actor Christ. But what was assumed by Christ in and through the family, which was Christ in some ways. I mean, we really do believe that Christ took flesh from Mary. He is Mary's flesh. I mean, that's just phenomenal to me. The idea that we can sort of separate him off and then make her unimportant, and even to the point of saying that she was with sin, I think is going to totally cloud the issue and make the androgynous Christ seem very appealing.
Yeah.
And,
Can you hand me the Bible?
Sure.
Thanks.
And if you want a quicker answer, the only people that ever believed in the androgynous Christ were the Gnostics and some of the Greek fathers.
Question 3b also talks about there's a question about the unique ability of Catholicism to solve the gender problem. I don't know if you want to, since you're kind of there.
Yeah, that is kind of there. This is Josiah, by the way. Everyone say hi to our Discord manager.
Yeah, thanks, man.
Josiah's the bomb. I don't know. Do you want to go there right now, Maria?
I also have a question from the live chat that's totally on a different topic if you want that one.
I want to stick with Galatians real quick.
As she's looking for it.
Yeah.
Since everybody is just a YouTube addict and will not be able to function with a silence, let's start like I do. Start twitching. I'll say that, yeah, I think we'll discuss it in more detail, but Catholicism does seem to answer this question because Catholicism conceives of unity, has preserved a metaphysics of unity where it's always considered as unity and difference. It doesn't see these things as somehow competitive, like all difference becomes homogenized into a lack of difference, and that's what we call unity. In a similar sense, like when we talk about the redemption of Christ, it fits with this metaphysical presumption that if Christ draws all things to himself, then what we should expect in this ever-growing unity that we call the church is not a destruction of difference and an exaltation of the same, but we should expect a greater difference tied more tightly together by greater bonds of love. That's the expectation. So when Christ becomes male as precisely as something different, it is for the sake of the female, because precisely because male and female are different from each other, that is the condition of possibility for their greater unity and love. So had he become the divine androgen, I think it would have been an actual negation of you can only understand it as a certain negation of the male and the female, for the sake of a unity that we do not know. It would have to be something that we cannot posit. We'd have to sort of push it to this next life. But I think that Catholics seem to me, on their best days, seem to be predisposed to view all unity as a unity of love, which means difference, which means the maintenance of the other and not the absorption of the other.
I think here you could probably make an aesthetic argument. Like one is just more beautiful. The androgynous Christ, the androgynous human nature. I mean, this isn't some like metaphysical, like dialectic, like waterproof argument, but it's certainly more beautiful. I think we all know this, that unity in difference is more beautiful. It's what makes a landscape so beautiful. It's what makes a bouquet so beautiful. It's because you have all these different elements that are united into like this one beautiful thing.
I was thinking about this because when I pray in the morning, which is maybe the only time that's safe to, this is the only time I can control to pray. Any other time is sort of like, inshallah, I will pray. But I look at a Madonna and Child, an icon that my dear friend Amber Noor wrote. And it's always appeared to me that Christ being sort of encapsulated by his mother in this embrace is a more profound recognition of who Christ is as an individual, like as just considering Christ. There's this beautiful impulse within Protestantism to say Christ alone, Christ alone, Christ alone. And I don't even want to deny that. I want to affirm it, but you will only understand Christ alone if you understand Christ with. because Christ
Right.
was never alone. He didn't come alone.
Right.
I mean, he was a baby.
I mean, what like the beauty of Christ is that this is God who has taken on human nature, which means to be embedded into history, into a family, into relationships,
Totally.
into obligations. And if he negates any of those things, then it's not really human nature. Like
Yeah,
the beautiful thing that we're claiming that makes Christianity so unique didn't actually occur.
Yeah, you have in the Old Testament this constant phrase, to being born of a woman, as a kind of lament of weakness. So you see this in Jeremiah, Psalms, definitely in Job. And what's amazing about, well, one of the things that's amazing about the redemption is that Christ becomes born of a woman. So he enters into this very condition of frailty. And what we've been trying to say all along is sexual difference is always the sign of our frailty. It's always a sign of us not being sufficient unto ourselves. It's always a sign of us not being God. And so there's no greater indication of this paradox than to consider Christ as necessarily embedded within a female body, and that the salvation that he effects happens in and through the salvation of woman.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to me, that is the sign, and a beautiful sign of it being real.
Speaking of sign, that's my favorite icon. It's the Theotokos of the sign. So it's an image of Mary, and her arms are placed upwards, and then in her womb still like is Jesus, and he's encircled by gold, and I think he's there kind of as a young like child man.
Yeah.
As he's so often depicted in
Yes.
icons, which is just so funny to me, but exactly, like he has this I think he has his hand raised in blessing, and then he's also holding the scroll, holding scripture. I know somewhere, I don't know where, there's someone made a monstrance of the Theotokos of the sign.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's really cool.
I want one.
But to kind of tie in some of those elements, like what, like why can Catholicism uniquely answer this question? I'm gonna kind of shift it to the androgen like topic and Christ in general. It seems to me that Christ taking on human nature, he what's incredible about this is that the infinite takes on particularity.
Yep.
And part of what it means to be human is to be a particular human, and it's to be male or female. And so like what we see Christ doing is actually entering into human particularity in a male body.
Mm-hmm.
He's entering into time. He has limited interactions with a few amount of people. Yeah, I think Catholicism is unique in answering the question in general, because we take the incarnation really, really seriously.
Totally. This reminds me of a joke.
Uh-oh.
It's an off-color joke. I won't tell it.
Okay.
All right, I'll tell it.
Please do.
Okay. So there was a husband who suspected that his wife was sleeping with the neighbor. So he came back from his work at an early time, and he found his neighbor in the closet. And he said, "What are you doing here?" And his neighbor said, "Hey, everybody's got to be somewhere." Because it's the particularity of the human person, you see.
Yes.
Sorry. Not helpful. Moving on. 0 laughs.
Do we want to talk about Galatians now, or save that for later?
I don't know. Well,
Yeah, let's
should we read
go
B?
for it.
Or talk about Galatians? Okay.
Yeah, well, it's a part of the question, and I think it comes up
Okay.
later too. One question when we're trying to figure out, like, okay, is human nature fundamentally androgynous? Is people will turn to Galatians 3. So I'll just read what is written. Where is it? Okay, so for in Christ Jesus you are all sons of God through faith. For as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female. For you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to promise.
That's awesome.
I think that this passage, rather than, I mean, you could take it on a quick read and just say, oh, like neither male nor female. Eventually, when we die and go to heaven, we're united to Christ. We'll be neither male nor female. We'll become this androgynous human soul.
Like Barbie and Ken. Sorry, they don't have like genitals. They're like a.
Oh.
Yeah. Anyways, continue. Last I checked.
So there's that take, but I think what's going on in this passage is actually affirming everything that we just talked about, the particularization of humanity, because what Paul always talks about is the law, and according to the law, the inheritance is always received by the firstborn free male. And he's calling upon this image to say that, like, you know, at the end of the day, there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, not because those aren't real, but because if you're united to Christ, you take on his, like, social status, essentially. Like, you become the Jew who is free, who is male, the firstborn son. And if he receives the inheritance from the Father, because you are one with him, in that particular relationship, in that particularity of humanity, then you receive salvation.
Which goes to show the not arbitrariness, but historical contingency of it, right? Like it didn't have to be the firstborn son.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't have to be that received the inheritance within Jewish culture. I mean, right? Obviously, it didn't have to be the Jews. They were chosen, like in history, in time. So you see that the negation here is obviously a negation, like neither male nor female, that's working within a gendered world construct. So that when we use it, it's not that God is sort of revealing that Adam and Eve were not in fact two distinct acts, I mean, of divine power. That's something that when Christ in the book of Matthew affirms the sort of original Genesis narrative there, that would not fit with what's being read here. So I think that's right. I think it's you're neither male nor female in relation to becoming what was considered an image, or becoming an image of what was considered to be worthy of inheritance.
Yeah, and the first line is, "For in Christ Jesus you are all sons of God through faith." I don't think this is just the idea of, oh yes, like we're all sons and daughters of God. I think the word sons is chosen for a reason, because
it reminds me of the kind of debates about why Jewish women don't get circumcised, which might sound obvious, but it is in fact a debate throughout the Midrash sort of literature. But one of the Christian critiques of the Jews back in the day was that their circumcision was limited to men. And so the Christian critique, when they talked about circumcision becoming a circumcision of the heart, it was to say, look, you had a sign of the covenant, and we know it's just a sign because it could only be done by men. We come and we bring something that both sexes can participate in, and so we must be a fulfillment of what was only a sign in the old covenant. That's a basic framework of a lot of different Christian arguments against the Jews, and I think it makes good sense. It's like, okay, yeah, that should answer that question, I think.
Okay, should we take another question, or
is there anything in the?
I have a couple from the live chat.
Do one. We'll spice it up. Live chat.
Sorry, let me
prearranged.
I have a couple from the live chat. Do you want the one that came first, but is a little?
I want every single one. Ask me anything.
That's a different. We're doing that later.
Oh yeah, that's right. Don't ask me anything. Ask me some things.
Spoiler alert. So I'll do the one that came first. To what extent does modern Does the modern witchcraft movement trend represent vernacular gender exiled and moved into the shadows? Young women who want to do formally feminine realm work with
Yeah.
herbs, crafts, cooking, etc.
Totally.
And how that is perfectly open and acceptable as a witch, but non-witch modern women are expected to
Oh, that's
want
funny.
success in
Who
the
is this
world.
person and how are their takes so hot?
This question is from a username 11T Levity.
Levity.
Yes.
Well, thank you for the question, sister of the Coven.
Coven.
Yeah, I think that's totally you're hitting the nail on the head. It's not really a question. You're just showing us how smart you are, but I would like to affirm you in that. It's hilarious that you can be like essentially a stay-at-home mom that has to cook things and make herbal remedies, and it's
If you're
cool
satanic.
because you're
You're a
worshiping
witch.
the gods. But if you're like, yeah, that's what I do, and I homestead, and I'm Methodist, they're like, you're a fascist.
Lame.
So, yeah. I don't know if you have. I feel like you have some witch friends that, or like more witchy friends. I don't know if they would identify strictly as witches.
Not particularly witch friends, but
Witch friends?
witch.
Witches.
Feel free if you just got that answer. If you actually want something more substantial from us to
Right.
ask more, because as it turns out, I think you're just dead right.
Well,
I will say
I
this:
guess I
it
can
links
have a
it.
comment.
Yeah, please.
Okay, my comment is that I can see that as kind of a resurfacing of a woman's world, or like an assertion of a woman's world, because, yeah, like you have a coven, like you have like a group of people,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's like it's a female space that
Yes.
men do not enter into,
Yeah.
and it obviously gives them a sense of power because it does, like when you have spaces limited to men or women, like it gives you power.
Yeah, and often the witch rhetoric is just the feminine empowerment rhetoric, just sort of with a mystical gloss, saying that, like, well, you really want to achieve this, then you have to have a sort of anti-patriarchal or patriarchal witchdom. But
it doesn't seem. I mean, it's not like it's not what Illich was describing, because there doesn't seem to be parallel worlds, or quite an equal, I don't know, kind of like frame for men.
yeah, we don't get to be wizards. Like, it's still not cool to be a wizard.
They're out there.
I'm not saying they're not out there. I'm saying it's not cool. It's like it's liberatory and like progressive to be a witch. But even to this day, and in our great leaps forward into the heights of progressivism, to be like, me and my wizard boys are just rejecting some of the dark elements of Christian culture, you're still kind of a guy pretending to be a wizard. Like, that hasn't quite left the mill.
Yeah,
mill
but
valuation.
I
except
guess
with a
like it.
W.
Maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like there's less of a group thing going on, which is what.
Right, because men are not being
talking about.
saved from much by being wizards. We already have groups. It's women that have been utterly destroyed in their ability to have communities apart from like some kind of competition within a male world.
Yeah, I feel like for men, it's more like kind of like individual pursuits of like power or insight or knowledge.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I'm generally seeing, but
What poisons the whole well here, which is funny because that's what witches did, or Christians, depending on who you're blaming. What makes this odd is that within American liberalism, you only get to have goods if you're destroying something. What I mean is, like, you don't just get to be a witch and like that's cool and it entails certain things that you do. You have to be a witch in a sort of awakened
rebel
mode of like rebelling
position.
against a Christian norm, and it only really has value insofar as you are being liberated from something that you're not. It only has value as this kind of stick it to the man approach, which is simply to become part of, like, you know, the Boston Tea Party of the soul, which is what every American aspires to. So to me, it has this
the
like
appeal is that it's edgy.
right, and so it has this possibility initially of like, wow, this is actually a world in which the feminine is being seen to have a certain sufficiency, but then precisely because it can't value itself as female, it has to be witchcraft in like the old sense, which is to say hateful, spiteful, and violent, and ultimately excluding others and sacrificing them. Yeah.
Do you want a less weird question?
Yeah, sure.
So I still can't say this guy's name. He's in our Discord, but he put this in the live chat. Sanfest. Yep, can't say it. He knows who he is.
What's up,
I know
Sam?
who he's talking about.
I can't. Could you pronounce it?
No.
Okay.
Can we call him Sam Festoon?
It's SANFEDISTI.
No, we're not going to try it. No.
Okay.
Why offend people?
We see more and more Protestant sects moving towards female pastors, and while obviously our church is settled on that topic, what, if anything, does this say about modern misunderstandings of gender?
I mean, I think that the most general answer is that we have a allergic reaction to anything that opposes the regime of the androgen. And so what a male priesthood does most fundamentally on a metaphysical level, so I'm not talking about doctrines, I'm not talking about even a Christological emphasis, which is all well and good. I'm talking about the very fact of having something that's just for men is itself offensive within a world predicated on the idea that sex is a secondary characteristic of what is fundamentally an androgynous human being. So you have to inhabit a male world as a female in order to affirm the liberal thesis that we are in fact all androgens, that we are all citizens, that we are all have this fundamental baseline equality, and that all difference is subsequent. Now, what the actual case is in terms of why this Protestant sect is saying, let's go the full priestess, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can see it as if you move away from the Catholic Church and you don't have like a role for women, and I think that's what happens, that would be a really natural response.
Totally.
Because the things that the priest does, a woman can do. Like, a woman can preach. She can say words while making gestures. That's what the priests do. They look just like this. So I think it's a natural response. So one of the things that I'm seeing is if you move to a position where Mary isn't important in your theology, and you also don't have female religious life, then understanding the unique role of women, it becomes a lot more difficult. I think with religious life in particular, because you have a role for women that is essential to the church, and in fact is like the highest like expression and sign of the church, of what it means to be the bride of Christ, which is ultimately what we're called to do. And this vocation is like not attached to like actually having children or families. If that's gone, then the only vocation that really makes sense for women is just to have family and children, and that's it. And so your understanding of woman and her role just becomes like truncated.
Yeah, totally.
And so I think there's a natural response to that, which is, yeah, and this doesn't quite cut it. Like, we need to expand, like, woman is more than just this role. And because we've already cut out religious life, cut out the role of Mary, then the natural move is to go to the priesthood.
Totally. In fact, I have nothing but sympathy here, because if you have the theology and the metaphysics that you do, which is basically those of liberalism, it would be a injustice to keep women from the priesthood. Like, what I mean is if what you're saying is that there's a reduction here, it's not sacramental in any meaningful sense, that it has the idea of in persona Christi is sort of, sapped of meaning, then at some point you're just doing it because it has a relation to the Catholic Church, not because you believe what the Catholic Church believes, at which point I think that if you're actually going to be nice to women as opposed to mean, you should let them become Protestant pastors. Does that make sense? Like, it's within the framework that you're operating in.
Yeah.
Why? What's the problem?
Yeah, and I haven't like fully thought out the idea, or at least how to articulate it. But there's been kind of a phrase that I've been thinking about for a long time that was mentioned to me like 3 years ago, and it's the Petrine is ordered towards the Marian.
Sounds like Balthazar.
probably.
Yeah.
I don't know where it came from. But yeah, like you have the male priesthood, but only in the Catholic Church do you ask the question, like, well, what is the priesthood for? It's not merely just so that everyone can have a personal relationship with Jesus. It's so that we can have that personal relationship as the one body who is the bride. Mm-hmm. So I think part of the glory of woman and her role comes from faith and trusting that there's going to be like an ultimate glorification of the feminine that's, I think, more hidden and obscured in this world. And that certainly seems to be the case from Mary. So I wouldn't be surprised if that pattern echoes down with all other women. Like, she was very humble, kind of a behind the scenes person. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until like after her Assumption that she begins to become more and more glorified within like actual people, humanity mm-hmm. here on earth. Mm-hmm. So I think that plays an element in there as well. If you don't like see that reality in the future, then it's going to be, and you're just fixated on the present, then it just feels like injustice.
Yeah.
Another question.
So there's a couple of similar questions. I guess we answered this somewhat. Less important and somewhat tangential to this is the historical question of whether the debates over soteriology, that's salvation, right? Mm-hmm. Particularly
the end things
in the Reformation, was in some way a precursor to the androgynous human of the Enlightenment. I think we've kind of answered that, or at least like we should have like the necessity of Mary within your theology of redemption.
It's going to change a lot, to say the least. Yeah, I think that's enough on
that
question.
I tend to agree with the direction you're moving, which emphasizes the differences between men and women in the male and female worlds that are constructed. It seems intuitively right that there's something incommunicable between those two worlds. Thanks. I wonder if you could say a bit more, though, about the principle of unity between men and women. If primal androgyny is not a thing, that seems to create a problem for liberal notions of equality and rights. Yeah, it totally does. Mm-hmm. Oh, he made that joke, which is obviously not a problem for a post-liberal think tank. It seems like you'd have to end up saying something like separate but equal. Well, the problem for Christians would be more on the level of salvation. And then he asks the same question about salvation. If what is not assumed is not redeemed, how are we to deal with the fact that Christ became incarnate as a man? Well, maybe we could answer the question about liberalism, because I think we've discussed, at least as best as we're able to, which is certainly not, saying much. The salvation question.
Yeah, that's fine.
So, I think the sense of this being troubled is correct, that you cannot have liberalism and sexual difference. You got to pick one. And even someone like de Tocqueville recognized this, and he talks about, for instance, the construction of the American citizen as a kind of androgynous construction that allows there to be a subject of rights that is fundamentally transcendent of sexual difference. Now, is it actually? No. But the ideal of the liberal society is obviously to impose itself upon the real such that actual men and women in their differences become the equal legal subjects of rights. Like we try to make the legal fiction the lived world, and we've talked about this a little bit. So to assert the opposite, that there is an incommunicable difference, means that the liberal rule of law is impossible, and in fact unjust even in its first attempt, which is to say that if I want to go out and rule at all within a metaphysics that we're describing, then the first thing that I know is that the same law cannot apply equally to the people that I govern. That there has to be a recognition of difference all the way down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, whether it's class or whether it's male and female.
Like male and female serves as the kind of fundamental. It's like, well, they're either going to be this or that if they're real. Mm-hmm. And then based on that fundamental difference, then all other fundamental differences are intelligible. And this one might be a child, and this one might be an adult. This one might have a lot of power. This one might have a little power. This one might be living here. This one might be living there. And then the kind of law that results has to be what Andrew Willard Jones describes as something that is personal. It's actually investigating persons. Aquinas has this little aside about law that it's always fundamentally dispensable, which means, and he says in respect to persons and circumstance, which means that whatever law you have, whatever constitution you have, if it is human law, then it must be by its nature dispensable. That is to say, someone with authority must be able to say, oh, this thing doesn't apply in this case. Oh, you're a woman, doesn't apply to you, right?
Yeah. So I guess.
And that goes. And the reason that I say this is just because that goes against the notion of liberalism, which is that a real rule by law and equality under that law is possible, even as an ideal. Whereas within the Catholic worldview, it's not possible and it's a bad ideal.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think that point is really obvious. Like, whenever you think of children, it's not like you like dismiss the moral law at any time.
Yeah.
Like, lying is still bad. Disobeying your parents is still a bad thing. But the kind of punishment or when you do things, how you do things, those are the things that are dispensable depending on the situation or how old the kid is. And I think everyone also knows that, yeah, if you want to rule people well, you just can't treat people like a giant mass.
Which means that you're limited in size, you're limited in scope, rule becomes more local. And obviously the opposite story of the rise of liberal nation states and then their extension into the global state economic tyranny that we have today. Now, this being said, it seems like, well, no, I think that's fine. I think that answers the question.
Yeah.
I apologize to everyone because I always can say more, and it's not because there's more to say. It's because I'm a raging egoist.
You just like to hear yourself talk.
So sometimes I'll do this thing where I'll be like, and I'm done, and it's like a literal.
You're just telling yourself.
Just like stop. So I do. So if I say something and then I stop myself, but you want to know more, you have to type. You got to do it. All right, just anybody watching this, or are we just screaming into the abyss here?
31 right now.
What's up, my 31? The chosen 30 and 1.
31 people, 31 live viewers.
If you're 1 out of 31, let me hear you. Sorry, go ahead.
Deafening silence.
Anybody here from Steubenville?
If you don't have any questions right now, then we can just keep moving on
there was... Sorry, I've got it open in the document, actually. So, there was another one about the circumcision, or more of a follow-up comment, if you want that. Or we have...
Let's talk about circumcision.
Okay.
I have a lot of thoughts. You would not believe.
I would.
All right. He would believe how many thoughts I have about circumcision.
I mean, I definitely would. So, Mary Angelica commented, I wonder if the Jews would have responded by pointing to the difference in purification rituals of moms and girls.
Yeah.
Were considered unclean twice as long as when girls were born versus when boys were born.
Pointing that out as like a equivalent to
and
circumcision.
Like saying that's
like their circumcision.
No. That's their answer to Christians saying.
Oh, I'm sure. Well, I'm sure they did that.
But purity. I mean, the purity rituals was so that you could go and worship.
Right.
And circumcision didn't play that role.
Yeah. No, circumcision
is a sign of a covenant.
Sign of the covenant itself. And was the marker of the Jew and non-Jew to the point that the non-Jew could be simply referred to as the uncircumcised. So that there is a sense in which it is the metaphor, and this is why Paul takes it up in his letters. It is the sign which then becomes a sign of universal salvation, namely a circumcision. It's not that Paul says, as men were circumcised and women were purified, now in Christ Jesus we can all be circumcised and purified. He says circumcision itself is now available to all of us. Or rather, what it signified, what it looked for, what it hoped for, what it...
Yeah, but I think you can just answer the question on what did people think that those rituals did.
Sure.
And it was just oriented towards worship, and it wasn't like being unclean was sinful. It just meant that you weren't in a proper symbolic state to worship God.
No, and I've read a lot on this, and there's a lot of great academic attempts by Jewish people, Jewish women, to look at the Torah and say that it has this kind of equality between men and women to it. I'm just not convinced. It seems to me that the object, or rather the the people who receive the Torah are men. You know, you think about like the law, even in the Ten Commandments, is like, do not covet your neighbor's wife. You know, it's like, it's obviously being given.
That was obviously directed towards women.
Yeah. Do not envy your neighbor's wife, maybe. So there is this sense in which, and I think this is really cool because it means that in the very law of God, there is a sign of its insufficiency. That it is for this particular people in this state of history, but that it is ultimately Christ. Christ is the law of God, and there's more to come. There's a history here. The church is coming.
Yeah, and I think it's helpful to see everything in the Old Testament, all the rituals and the law was given to people of a certain historical context, and we already know that there are certain things in the law that were allowed because of the character of the people at that time.
Yeah.
Or like with Abraham and polygamy and things like that, or the laws about divorce. Jesus talks about that too. Yeah, so the covenant being directed first towards men in that way, I could see being a part of that historical time.
And if you're feeling left out because you don't get to be circumcised, you should tune into our next season. Because I think that circumcision is a sign of the woman inscribed in the flesh of the man. Next question.
Just gonna leave it at that.
Never mind. We'll go with the questions from the people who can't ask you questions at other times.
Sure.
What about people who don't fit into the temperament or ability of their respective gendered worlds?
Is this one of the previous ones, or was this just?
It came in the live chat
Oh,
too, so I
because I remember
like a document of the live chat questions open, so I don't lose them.
Yeah, this is a great question, and someone, at least in the YouTube comments, has been asking something similar, and it seems like a really good time to give a thorough answer.
John K.
What's up, John?
Where
It was in 2, right?
Yeah, it's under construction.
Yeah, C, 2C.
Okay. Should I read that?
Yeah,
one?
go ahead and read that because
okay. So this is asking the same thing, but while distinct and complementary gendered worlds would certainly be far more fulfilling and harmonious than our current arrangement, there's still the issue of those who innately don't fit into their respective worlds, who have a particular talent or calling for something that is reserved for the other gender. The individual's talent or calling can't win every time. Women can't be priests, no matter how pastoral they may be. But neither is God above calling his saints to transgress into the other gender's world.
Totally.
St. Joan of Arc being the prototypical example. These examples are rather extreme special cases, but I'm interested in how conflicts between individual gifts and inclinations and societal constructs of gender are meant to be resolved. This is a great question.
It's an awesome question.
Yeah, I guess my first response or thoughts to this question is that that's on purpose. Like, it's kind of the point that there's going to be people who don't fit in. And what I mean is that when we're constructing gendered worlds and ways of doing things, that is contingent. It doesn't have to be this way. There's multiple good ways of doing it. And so that inevitably means that if you choose a particular path, you're excluding other things that could be there. And not everyone's going to fit. And what's so awesome about that is that it keeps us from absolutizing
Totally.
Our constructions, which I think is really important. We don't want to confuse our law for God's law. Totally. We don't want to divinize our constructions.
Actually, we really do want to, but we ought not want to.
Right. So I think it's really like it's an exciting and like a good thing when we experience tension.
Yeah.
Because it reveals the contingency of our own creations.
Yeah.
It reveals that man is not God. And I think that's also the space where creativity happens too.
Totally.
I mean, I can think of just in art or in music. You have like you go to art school, or you go and you learn music, and like typically it seems that you're trained under a instructor in a particular manner, in a particular way. You learn of doing the art that way, And this can be constraining, but it's only through like knowing those like constraints first that you have the opportunity to kind of like bend backwards and make something new and creative coming out of it. I don't know if that
Well, I think
makes a
it's
whole
it's
lot
a
of sense.
hard question for Americans, liberals generally, to hear, because for us, the image of a world that's contingent and built through the creative use of human power is our boogeyman. It's the bad thing. And then the image of the one who finds within themselves some kind of difference to this world, which demands conformity through its various social regulations and social power, is the American hero. So he is the one who's most exalted in our culture. He's the subject of all our movies. So that when this question's asked, you have to beg people kind of to take a critical look at our own culture, which is to say, Joan of Arc, for instance, was not the gender rebel. That would have been insane, I think, to someone like Joan of Arc, because the presumption of the Middle Ages, and going on even for a little bit, was that society was a good thing to be preserved, that a peace between peoples was greater than any individual self-satisfaction, and that the common good was always to be loved above one's private good, such that if you were to describe Joan of Arc as like casting off an oppressive gender system as some sort of, it would be highly silly, anachronistic.
Yeah.
And the reason that I think it's important is to show that within gendered worlds, to break with the contingency of the construction is not to somehow assert the superiority of the individual creation over the social construction.
Yeah, it seems to highlight it.
Precisely,
more.
to highlight it, right? Like, it's if I, as a man, have some proclivity to perform well, something that belongs properly to the gendered world, and that this becomes necessary for me to do, then I am showing precisely in my not being a woman by doing that activity what women look like in our society. Like, you reveal the difference precisely because it is something that is strange. And this is tough. Again, it's tough for us to, I think, understand. One of the things I've said before, and I'll say it again because why not, is that Judith Butler ruined drag. Like, it's not fun anymore, because if everything is just a power construction and there's no such thing as male or female, then a male dressing as a female can only be a fundamental existential metaphysical point. It's like, I have destroyed your presumption of naturalness.
Judith Butler destroys.
Exactly. Whereas when you see drag, when you see cross-dressing within, say, the medieval world, Illich makes this point, it's always has a symbolic value outside of just like negation. It has a symbolic value because it says, remember that you are but a man. Remember that this is contingent. Remember that this is just a construction. And so it can have that effect, and it can be fun. It can be an actual rejoicing in creatureliness and an affirmation of the other side. I mean, this is what I think sometimes people like girls like to see a guy act like a woman, and they laugh.
Yeah, it's really
in part
funny.
because it's very affirming, because what does it say? It says, oh, you noticed us. Now, they
Yeah.
might also be laughing, but of course, a man acting like a woman is never acting like a woman. He's acting like a man acting like a woman,
Yeah.
right? So there's this layer of humor where the worlds remain incommunicable. But what's given in drag in this sense is care. It's like, I've been watching. I see how you do things. I think it's funny. Like, and vice versa. Like, if you're ever with a man, generally speaking, is always pleased to have a group of girls make fun of men in his presence. Now, obviously, this is not true if it's invoked with the spirit of bitterness, which sort of has all of our, which is sort of seen as the only way to do drag now. And I'm speaking of drag in a very obviously broad way here. So that's what's lost to us, because we can only view it as a heroic moment of casting off an oppressive gender system. So we can never have it as a moment of love in which we affirm and point to our care and attention to the other sex and to the very contingency of those gendered worlds. So what do you do if you don't fit in, I guess, is sort of maybe the more practical question. What do you do if, given that there's something remaining of a gendered construction within our society, What if
Yeah.
you don't fit in with that in particular? And I think, if you don't mind, I have like two thoughts on this. One is that
Yeah.
typically not fitting in with like Western liberal, sort of what's remaining of the gendered worlds, is probably a good thing.
Yeah.
Because what you really don't fit in with is the androgynous ideal that takes on male and female as a sort of skin.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, if you really are in a world, maybe still, I don't know if this happens still, where it's like men are the ones who like sports or something, and you don't fit in, like, it's sorry, there's so much to say. It's precisely because we've reduced gender to this secondary characteristic that a teenager can be thrown into crisis because he doesn't have some kind of part of this, what's left of the gendered construction. Like, the only world in which it makes sense to say, like, I never liked sports growing up, maybe I'm trans, is a world in which sex never mattered to begin with. It's like it always was just those secondary characteristics. That
Yeah, like
modification.
it's like to be a man or to be a woman is not to be like lifted up into adulthood, into this world with relationships and responsibilities, because like you're working for the thriving of your family and community. It's something like very serious. But if what it means to be a man or a woman is like, well, I like these things.
Yeah, it's a list of modifications of the androgen, and if you don't have all the modifications, suddenly your supposed secure sex is thrown into doubt. And so I see it in the trans person, and then in the like, like hardcore, like manly man cave sort of conservative type, like the same premises are operative, namely that this is something produced. Maleness is produced through these characteristics, and if we can't produce them, we don't have male anymore.
Yeah. And I think maybe another kind of implicit assumption would be that like if a woman feels like I don't like fit in these like female spheres, like I want to be doing this thing that mostly men are doing, like, I don't know, engineering. There's this assumption that like when I enter into that sphere, I'm not going to be doing that in a precisely feminine way because of who I am.
Yeah.
Like that possibility isn't really thought about.
Gives way more credit to the field of engineering than it deserves.
So I think when it comes to that question, there's kind of a couple layers. And one is that, like, is tension between you and the construction fundamentally bad? And the answer is no.
Right.
That's kind of a part of what it means to be human.
Yeah.
Like, we'll always experience tension, and this is part of our growing pains. This
Freedom.
is part of what it means to construct and to be creative. It's a fundamentally good thing. And then I guess the follow-up question would be what you're talking about, which is kind of the practical question. Like, okay, well, like, what am I to do? I'm experiencing this tension, and that's where like evaluation and judgment comes in.
Yeah.
And I think to answer that, it'd be helpful to read another question, which was on.
I'm going to respond to your question with another question.
The other question on construction. So this one is, what principles/values can be used to judge whether a given gender construction is good or bad? And I guess to expand that question, like not only like judging constructions, but also my response to this construction.
Yeah.
Because I can't work outside of what's given.
Right.
And I think if we're thinking about these ideas and thinking about it specifically in our context, we can judge the present construction and recognize that this is not ideal. But then we still have to respond out of what is given.
Yeah. And this is where I was going with saying that we need to recall our own liberalism, the liberalism of the heart. Because whenever we're in a situation where we're like, oh, the society around me is terrible, and I, as an individual, am different, you should be really cautious about what you do next, because it's very likely that you're acting out your favorite movie. And you just need to be careful, because as Catholics, we can't act out any of those movies. Only EWTN movies are allowed to us, and we know this.
That are pure
So
flex.
what I mean to say is, this: for the Catholic, society is good, and unity is good, and it is not the case. Yeah, difference is good, but it's difference for the sake of unity is in love. So, to my mind, when that tension is felt, the answer is to just be careful and not jump into the mode of the liberal hero, which, Satan did pretty well. But to say, okay, now I need to be cautious and loving in justice towards others for whom the construction is working. I mean, what makes a Catholic, Ratzinger says this, is he's the one who is being for the other. And so it seems to me what differentiates us, if we're at all differentiated from the world here, it has to be that, not that we say that the construction is absolute, not that we go the trad route and say that this is just, we can't deviate without sin from a particular construction of this particular decade. But to say, given this tension, how do I enact how do I live for others in a way that creates more peace, that brings people closer to Christ and doesn't scandalize? And this is really tough because it means that you have to slow down and you completely lose the kind of joy of rebellion that's lost to you. Instead, you have to do this work of, like,
you have a responsibility. It's like, I have this tension within myself, and this is a possibility for great love and unity and creativity. And because we live in a fallen world, the working of that out is going to be painful, difficult, unclear.
Yeah, and because we live in a liberal world, the working out of an individual difference within a gender construct is always going to appear to others as being a repudiation of the construct as meaningless, and this is where there's just great caution required. Like, there's things that I don't do that I know would be morally fine, like in terms of crossing gender lines that are established within our society, that I don't do for the sake of other people, not because I think it has some kind of absolute value, but because what is left of gender in these ruins is worth preserving, even if it means sacrificing what I might experience as like a certain individual authenticity.
Well, Paul talks about that too when he talks about, is it eating the sacrifices?
Yeah.
Of
food sacrifice to idols.
Yeah, because I if I'm remembering this right, he recognizes that morally there's no offense with this anymore. But if you're evangelizing Jews, if you're living in a Jewish community, you need to not act like a Gentile because it'll be a stumbling block to your brothers. And so he's able to recognize both. The law doesn't apply to me anymore, but I'm still going to constrain myself to the law because I love. And then to look at...
Sorry, I just had a really particular example of this. Like, in doing Shakespeare, when we put on Shakespeare plays, there's like all these opportunities for drag. And specifically the play, not As You Like It. Maybe it's As You Like It, when they're in the woods the whole time.
Midsummer's Night Dream?
No, the other woods one. It's a lot like Midsummer. Dang it!
Where's Ruben when you need him?
Ruben!
I don't know.
Anyways, the whole like comedic shtick of it is that, I'm gonna get this wrong. A girl is in love with a guy. She dresses up the girl dresses up as a guy to be able to consort with the guy, and then pretends as the guy that she is a girl to help him learn how to woo a woman. So it's like layers and layers of stuff.
Oh, this is awesome.
Now, it's hilarious. It's great. It would be an awesome play. Is it possible to put on right now? And the more I read it, the more I thought no, because the very signs of the distinctions and of the doubling ups and of the mimicry and the parody has become a source of it's a great stumbling block for people with, that it shouldn't be. Maybe in Steubenville it's a little less than other places, but I still, in looking at this play and thinking about whether to perform it, was like, there's a degree of holiness that's required for this to work, and not to enter into this mode of a bitter spitting at what's left of the gendered world. Yeah. Which is, that's the other thing about living in liberalism that's really funny. It's like we're all so mad about gender, like ruining our lives, and it is so dead. Like, this is the definition of beating a dead horse. We need the horse to still have enough life in it to justify our own like rage for gender equality. But it's like it's almost completely gone. If like what is getting us up and offended is that like men are sometimes too loud or something, and that's like the source of the crisis. It seems like we are grasping at straws to maintain our positions of
Yeah, or you
Victims
can
and-
even see it like kind of the more feminist angle, like where there's anger at men, but really it's like the turning of women into men, or expecting women to be men in order to reach some ideal.
Yeah.
That's, yeah, the erasure of gender is the problem, not gender itself. But before we do move on to the next question, there's a really helpful passage also from Galatians that answers this question. So,
Yeah.
how are we to evaluate the construction of gender? Or it would also work with my response to construction. This is Galatians 5. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. I think that's the key to evaluating gender constructions, because there's an infinite way that we can do it.
Yeah.
So if we look at America, our world today, and ask, like, are these fruits of the Spirit being born within our gender construction? Yeah, obviously not.
Yeah, it's probably more the fruit of the flesh, or how does he describe it? 'Cause
Yeah.
it's a parallel, right?
Now the works of the flesh are plain: immorality, impurity, licentiousness, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, anger, selfishness, dissension, party spirit, envy, drunkenness, carousing, and the like. That seems to be the fruit of our culture. Yeah, so I think using that as an evaluative tool
Yeah, because there was
is really helpful.
totally.
Yeah, and
Is there
it's a
peace
way
here?
that isn't saying like I could see someone joining in this conversation and then like wanting to like figure it out. So what is the ideal construction of genders? Like there is none. There is no ideal. There's just multiple good and creative possibilities. And so the question is this producing the fruits of the Spirit? And I think you can evaluate that on like the larger scale of what's going on in modernity in general, but then there's your response to it. So in your actual family, in your relationships with men and women, what kind of fruit are you producing? Is your rhythm of life producing those things?
Yeah.
If you just keep aiming for that, that's how I think. Yeah, if we were asking the practical question of like what comes next,
Totally.
seeking ways of life and doing things that are producing those fruits.
And this is a
It's
different
important.
this is different than a androgynous standpoint from which to judge gendered worlds. There's a question for us 2a, but since gender presupposes an other, does this indicate that a construction of one gender can only be judged as good or bad in relation or relatively to the other gender, or can each gender's construction be judged independently from the other, at least in some respects? If they can be, wouldn't that indicate a more fundamental human nature shared by both, which is then dimorphized? I.e., wouldn't that indicate a primal androgyny?
Back to androgyny.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point. So the question is something like, if we can say, hey, this gendered world doesn't work, doesn't that presuppose that we have some genderless standpoint with which to judge it as okay, well, that's a modification of the real thing, which is this human nature? And I think that's just I don't think that's true, because that's not what peace is. Again, this goes back to that metaphysics of like what unity is unity in difference. It's the fact that there's a relation of love between two, and the unity is the two relating. It's not the two being negated into some more fundamental thing. And so when we say that the fruit of the Spirit is peace, and when we then say that peace, therefore, is what determines, or rather is the mark by which we judge a gender construction as being good, is in its production of that peace. What we're not saying is that the peace is somehow shared equally and symmetrically between men and women. That's just not what peace means. Peace means that in their differences, everyone is receiving what is due to them. And, well,
I mean, you're being for the other, but since I'm a
becoming
particular, I can only give to other people certain things. I'm limited in the gift that I can give, and so our reciprocal gift is going to be obviously asymmetrical.
right. And I think you see this like in the popes, like they have a few encyclicals, Humanae Vitae is the obvious one, Donum Vitae, but that are kind of questions about life and gender and touch on this idea of, well, what's the proper construction of gendered worlds? And they don't offer like a positive vision of, okay, do this, right? But what they do offer is a critique and saying, like, if we have, for instance, contraception, then we will have this particular discord in marriages. We will have this particular ill treatment, injustice of men towards women, because women will become considered as merely available to them for sex, which has been detached from its procreative meaning. So you have this warning that you have a warning of like what happens when the peace is destroyed between men and women. But as far as the actual nature of that peace, so, well, what is it exactly when men and women aren't in this kind of angry and competitive and resentful relationship? The church is actually very silent, and I think that that's proper.
Yeah.
In some ways, because
Right.
because in that silence is human freedom. In that silence it's a silence in the face of human creativity that it doesn't
It's
know.
a pregnant silence.
Yeah.
And another part of that question is, can you judge the construction of one gender without relation to the other? I mean, ultimately, no. I mean, they work together, but I think also there is evaluation that does happen of the particular domain, because that's how you like understand belonging to that category.
Yeah.
So I guess like yeah, to be like a little bit more personal, yeah, and when I was in high school, there was many ways that I felt like I didn't like fit into like the gendered domain of women. Girls would act in like a certain way, and I just like didn't fit in with like certain crowds. And so then that, I think, seems to be an evaluation of the construction of what it means to be woman. Like, is what it means to be like a girl or to fit in with these women means to dress like this and talk about these shows and act like this and like talk about boys like this. And if I don't fit into that, does it mean that I'm not female, that I'm less feminine, or maybe that's just a bad construction of femininity? And those were the conclusions that I was coming to in high school. I was like very adamant, like I didn't want to be that girl.
Yeah. Well, it's sad because within our current state, we lose critics of the construction, because every time you approach the point of criticism, it becomes evidence that you are in fact the other gender, or that you have some other, heroic difference vis-a-vis the construction, that then all of your energy, rather than going to reform, which is the Catholic moment, right, of like the construction is like the fact that we are constructing is good, exactly how we are constructing is bad. I experience this tension, therefore I live a difference that actually moves the construction in a different direction. Instead of that, we say, oh, well, then I don't belong to this, like on an ontological level, and now I'm going to be something else. So I cut the relationship. I'm not a woman. I am this other thing. I'm agender. I'm
like
gender ambivalent.
A specific story, and like I have a feeling that probably like there's a lot of young girls who could relate to this. I remember going to Catholic retreats and conferences, and there would be like a women's talk. And during the women's talk, the female speaker would like kind of make an appeal to her audience, and she would say something like, yeah, like I know what you guys do on your Friday nights. Like you get together, you have your sleepover, you watch like some like romance film, and you just eat chocolate and you talk about boys all night. And like this was not the experience of my friends and I in high school. Like I didn't fit into that paradigm. I didn't love wearing pink. I didn't like love like everything sparkly. And so kind of like what you're saying, the bad reaction would be to look at that kind of construction. I mean, glitter pens didn't exist forever, so how's that like a sign of the feminine? Okay, I don't fit into this construction, like therefore I must be the other thing. Well, what if there's just other ways to be feminine? And that was eventually kind of what I found by reading Theology of the Body. I eventually figured out, oh, by being myself, I actually become more feminine. And part of the exciting thing is that I don't really know what that means for me.
Totally. It's an open-ended reality. That's what's so cool about it.
And if we're looking at, again, the fruits of the Spirit, and aiming towards virtue and seeing constraints as like opportunities to grow in virtue and to be really creative in that. I think that's kind of how I learned how to grow to be more feminine and more myself. So I didn't really see not fitting in those ways as being an obstacle. Like I saw this as being a good thing, so I could, like discover my own femininity in a different way. And like a lot of women, we're not all the same. We're very, very different. So
Truth.
it's not that difficult to come to that conclusion, but I think sometimes, like, I just remember reading some of the journals of the girls that I was teaching in high school and seeing that they were going through similar questions. Like I don't fit in with this crowd, and especially high school can be really, really cliquey.
Yeah.
And like, okay, I don't fit into this clique. Does this say something more fundamental about who I am? Like, I'm not feminine. I'm not a woman, or
Yeah, and when
those
you
things.
get rid of God and you get rid of the creation and the real, then all you've got is cliques. I mean, that's what academia has basically proclaimed, right? It's all just powerful assertions of an identity, which is basically high school.
Yeah.
All right,
You want another one?
yeah, hit us with it. Give us
You
the
want a
juice.
serious one, or somebody asked a funny one?
Oh, I love funny ones. Give me the funny one first.
Can you philosophize about why women go to the bathroom in groups and men do not?
Yes. Now, what to say?
Safer not to go.
Women,
alone.
as I understand it, sing in polyphony when they go to the bathrooms, whereas
It's true.
men chant in simple tone.
I've missed that.
Oh, it's embarrassing for you.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's a problem. I'll have to work on that.
No,
Well,
I think
I've-
that
I mean, if you're with a group of women and you want a female space that can't be
Yeah, that's what
invaded
I was
by
gonna say.
men, bathroom.
yeah, no, like we talked about this as a joke, but I really think it's true. Like the remains of the gendered world is a bathroom.
Yep.
And the people who have been absolutely destroyed by the loss of gender are women, not men.
Mhm.
That's what it means to live in a liberal nation state, is to experience the constant destruction of women
It's
as
our
women.
rebellion against the androgynous order.
You go
We're
to the one
bringing
place you
back
have.
the vernacular world by going to the bathroom in groups.
I
This
don't
is
think
what we
it's actually
do.
that complicated. I don't think it has anything to do with like the biological sort of arrangement of sexual difference. And I think it's in fact like if the opposite were the case and we lived in a sort of overbearing maternal society in which we
Yeah.
had to like because of something about the way you make money, you had to be more and more like a woman, which doesn't make sense to us. But say that was true, then men would go to the bathroom together in groups.
Yeah, I
women
feel
would
like
be
it's the
fine going on
equivalent
their
of
own.
men going outside to smoke.
Yeah. Anyways,
All right.
good question.
Um,
Thank you for lending us that opportunity to philosophize on something we hadn't thought about before.
I didn't write down who asked this question, but it's good. Somebody else. Cactoid Jim asks.
Cactoid?
Cactoid Jim.
Is that like things of
It
and
sounds
relating
like-
to
It sounds like one
cacti?
of those. You know how sci-fi refers to like all aliens as humanoids.
Yeah, cactoids.
Cactoids.
All the species of sentient cactuses.
Right. Sick of
Cactoids.
these cactoids.
So, Sentient Cactus Jim asks, how do we promote and preserve gender difference in a society which refuses to recognize cultural construction and gender roles and is mostly incapable of even understanding metaphysics?
Signs. We need
Which
more
goes into
signs.
the other
We need to
question
just
somebody
hear
asked.
signs.
Male space.
Somebody
We
asked
need
if you
more of
could-
those billboards on the side of the highway that I see every time I go home. Marriage, one man, one woman. Hell is real.
Oh, you're driving towards Indiana, like because you're going to
yeah, towards
Cincinnati.
Cincinnati.
Yeah.
Yeah.
uh-huh.
Yep,
Hell is
I know
Those
that.
real.
are those are away from Indiana too.
Right.
Yeah.
I understand that. Well, Indiana is
That
hell,
makes me laugh
so
every time.
it makes sense.
I
Hey
love
there.
this.
Easy. Well, that goes into the other question somebody asked, which is Maria.
Oh,
Can you talk about gender roles versus gender symbols?
Sweet.
You made that a
Ooh.
distinction a while back and said you have more to say.
don't leave. Can we go back to the other question first?
You said the answer to the other question
Oh.
was the answer to this question.
The answer is more signs.
You said the answer is more signs, right?
Sorry, that coffee is cold. I'm just getting hot coffee. I actually am not listening.
Can you read the first question again?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, because we started
Yeah.
doing a bit, and that's not good. No one deserves to have a bit done about their question.
How do we promote and preserve gender
yeah.
difference in society which refuses to recognize cultural construction and gender roles and is mostly incapable of even understanding metaphysics?
Virtue.
Become Catholic.
Yeah.
And make other people Catholic too.
Cool.
I mean,
do you
like,
want to answer the symbol question, or do you just?
well,
want to
it seems like the. I mean, you can kind of do the math puzzle if you want. If what we're saying is that gendered worlds are destroyed for the sake of a androgynous ideal, which is necessary for the full functioning of liberal capitalism, then and that we're describing this anthropology of liberalism as being fundamentally opposed to what preceded it, which was the church, then the reverse engineering move is not complicated. It's the move that's always been there, which is to become Catholic and to become virtuous in and through the grace that belonging to the body of Christ makes possible.
I have another thought too. So someone emailed me, and I can't remember who this is, and they suggested that I read Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, which was excellent. This essay was so much fun to read. So she opens it. She's asked to write an essay, I'm assuming for like a conference to other women on women and fiction. And so she just says, "Well, I'm a fiction writer, so I'll tell you a story about this woman who's like basically me, but also like not really me, trying to answer this question." And so she goes and researches women, and then is like trying to learn about fiction, and is just like confused because there's so many books and so many opinions, and most of them are written by men about women. She's like, okay. And she says, okay, I can't really tell you about women, can't really tell you about fiction, but I can tell you two things: that for women to write fiction, they need a room of their own and money. Which was really funny, but I think is absolutely true. So one of the experiences that the character / her had, she was going to a women's college in Uxbridge, and visiting her friend, and I think this was the only established women's college that was there. And so she started kind of like noticing that like the building wasn't as like nice and as beautiful as the other buildings that were out there. The food that was being served there wasn't like as rich as the other colleges that she had been to, like invited for dinner parties. And that this was relatively recent. And then so like she started kind of thinking to herself like, like why didn't our mothers just like work hard and get like super filthy rich and then have all this money so that they could donate it to make this beautiful college so that we could come and write fiction? Because we all know that to write good fiction, like you need a beautiful atmosphere, and like you need like good food, you need like space and silence. And then oh wait, they were having children, like they didn't have time to get filthy rich. And so her point was essentially Illich's point. That's why I had so much fun reading it. Which is like women, if we're like taking care of families, don't have the same capacity to just get like filthy rich and pass off the inheritance and establish colleges for women. So when we're talking about the response to that question, like how do we, I can't remember how it went, like uphold or establish gendered?
Promote and preserve gender difference.
Yeah. Like giving women a room of their own.
I mean,
and money, like a women's space, essentially.
And the irony here being that men have to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. Like men and women have different kinds of power and hold power in different ways. And pretty much the main and underlying principle of Catholic social teaching is that power is always for the other, especially for the sake of the weak. And so if there's someone who like fundamentally like cannot like earn that power in the same way as you, then your obligation is to serve them.
Mm-hmm.
And like I mean, like you see this in households where the father, who's the one who's like making all the money and has arguably the most like external, like viewable power of the family, when he is entirely for his wife, when he's entirely for his children. Like he's literally providing a room of their own, like room for the children, like space and domain for his wife. I think that's a way.
Yeah, and it's sort of this silly modern problem we have that the only kind of domain and authority that counts is the stuff that we somehow make on our own. And so there's this sort of kill switch within feminism where it's like you need men to establish the kind of world that has that kind of space, but you can't accept it if it's from men at the same time.
Do you ever remember the he for she movement?
No, that sounds like a 2014 thing.
I think all I remember is that and Emma Watson.
Okay.
I don't know anything else about it, but I think like that general concept is like, yeah, that's Catholic.
Yeah.
He for she. Maybe it has nothing to do with Catholic ideals. Maybe it's totally the opposite. But
I would just like to point out that we're very close to a Catholic defense of the male feminist.
no.
I'm going to own it. Next question.
Next question.
Is that the symbolism question?
Here's the Catholic
It is
take.
the
Only
symbolism
males
question,
can be.
unless you want me to skip
No,
it.
no.
Wait, I had an offensive take that only males can be truly feminists. Women can't.
That take is great because it's
true.
offensive.
Not just that.
Anyway.
Sorry, continue.
Well, yeah, okay. I didn't mean that in the way that it came across. I apologize.
Josiah's just here for the mud raking, the offensive one-liners, the bumper stickers. He's
Read
a
the question.
shallow soul.
Pat Neve from The Crunch asks, Maria,
Pat.
can you talk about gender roles versus gender symbols? You made that distinction a while back and said that you had more to say.
Yeah, now I'm gonna have to remember where it's coming from. See, my trick is that when the questions are asked, you speak first because I'd take longer to think about things.
Oh, I thought that was
But
just
now,
like a chauvinistic sort of thing. You're using it.
I
Brilliant.
am using it.
That's the proper feminine thing. You let the man experience himself. It's a gift of women that men can experience themselves as more powerful than women. Anyways, thank you for the gift. Now, answer the question.
Yeah, gender roles versus gender symbols. Man, I'm gonna have to ask Patrick to put more context to that. I don't really know where to go with it. I mean, there is a distinction.
Symbols, there's already more context in the chat.
Oh, great.
Symbols like cycles and linears.
Oh,
Roles like domains of a person and things.
yeah. Yeah, so I think like when we're trying to understand the feminine, symbols are really helpful. So I'm just going to start referencing a book that I read a while back. It's called The Language of Creation by Mathieu Pajot, who is Jonathan Pajot's brother. And the basic premise of the book is really something that all the church fathers say, and that is that creation is a language, that it's expressive, and what it's fundamentally doing is like expressing creatively and diversely the reality of God. And so we know from Revelation that being made male and female that's how we image God, and the way that we do that is different. And so part of the way that we start to be able to read that is through symbolism. Like what is this saying about the divine, or what is this like fundamentally meaning? So yeah, when it comes to like women, women I think are tied to the symbol of the cycle, because that's the way that our bodies function. And so we have this like fundamental kind of almost primordial symbol that's always associated with women, generally speaking, across cultures. But the way that interplays with gender roles would be like, okay, so here's like this kind of symbolic reality about what it means to be a woman, but there's a difference between that and then how that symbol is manifested in culture and the actual instantiation of it. The first example that I'm thinking of is like when to bring back the image of like cyclical time versus progressive time, and that that relation between men and women. You can start to see a certain symbolic fittingness of the male priesthood and like the female feminine church. So you have the male priesthood that's like leading the church forward, and I think that's especially like symbolically present in the extraordinary form when the priest is like facing away from the people, almost as if to go up a mountain. And then you have like the feminine image of like the church herself as like the bride, as the receiver. That's kind of my best take. So you've symbolic realities, and then you have like fitting constructions, and they could be constructed in different ways, but that's how I would see them relating to each other, but being distinct. I hope that helps.
All right, before we do more from the live chat, let's just take the last of our first section. The first one is pretty similar to other ones, but I think there's a worthwhile point here. If androgyny is a way to assert divinity, why was Jesus begotten as a man and not as an androgen? So this time I don't want to answer the question in terms of human nature, which we've done. See the beginning of this episode. But rather in terms of the way that androgyny asserts divinity. It precisely asserts it, right? It is the way of producing in the human person the appearance of the divine by a negation of that reminder of the goodness of our creaturely status, which is sexual difference. So it is divine by way of aping, mocking, imitating. It is not divine by way of nature. And so androgyny is always associated with idolatry, and is in fact a good red flag for it. So when Jesus was begotten as man, it was to say precisely that I am not like your idols. The true God is not what you think. It's a surprise, because all sex is a surprise. You never know if someone's going to be a male or a female. All right, E. Okay, so here's the speculative question. What are the chances for the resurrected body to be androgynous?
0%.
Yeah, we're going to be circles.
Spheres.
Yes. So the question of the resurrected body being androgynous is a darn good question. It actually comes up in the tradition a lot, because we ask this question, if there's no reproduction in heaven. Will there be reproduction in heaven? First question. General consensus. No. None of it. Second question. What are we going to do with our genitals? A lot of interesting and speculative responses to this from the fathers, and we appreciate them. But it's actually fascinating, because if you take the basic approach of what we've been describing generally as a sort of conservative biologism, I understand this offends people, but that's sort of an easy way for me to refer to it, then it is weird that our resurrected bodies have the markers of sex, specifically genitalia. Why? Because if sex can really be reproduced to the need for reproduction in the same manner in which an animal's sex can be reduced to its need to reproduce a species in time, then when we do not reproduce, these things seem extraneous, right? They're just hanging out. Yep. They're sort of like awkward reminders of a previous time before we were glorified. Like, remember back in the day?
Not anymore.
Okay. If sex means more, then it's quite possible that what we're living under...
Sounds like a good bumper sticker.
What?
Sex means more.
If it means more, then it's possible that we're living under a historical moment in which we have been subordinated to a certain imitation of animal reproduction in existence. Show my cards. This is exactly what I think. I think that the sign of Adam and Eve being garmented in animal skins is most properly understood as a sign of them entering into an imitation of animal sexuality, because for the first time, they experience death as a looming reality, right? As a possible part of their existence. And so then the multiplication of individuals now, instead of being fruitful and joyous, because when you multiply individuals in a world of people who never die, you can only be doing it for their sake and for the good of the community as a whole. You can never be doing it as a sort of worried, scared
I will
fight.
not be provided for when I.
Well, not even
die.
not be provided before, but like to not even continue in
Yeah.
any meaningful way. So they are clothed in the skin of animals in the sense that we now imitate what is true of the animals, that the individual is subordinated to the species, and that in its reproduction of the species in each individual, it survives death, right? So the species is the only thing that is eternal. When the cat dies, it dies forever. It's not there in heaven. Sorry, kids.
Doesn't have 9 lives either.
Yeah. Now, the species cat might be there in heaven.
I made a kid cry once because I told them their dog wasn't going to heaven. It was a bad pastoral move.
No. What you say, this is what I've been saying to kids. No. You don't understand. It's not that your dog doesn't go to heaven. It's that your dog doesn't really exist now. It's just an instance of a species type. Sorry, bud.
It's like, if you need your dog to be happy, then it'll be there. Plot twist. You don't.
Anyways, not the point. The point is that if that is a historical reality of the fall, that we're living this imitation of animal sexuality, then it is very simple and easy to say that sex means something more. Now what I believe to be the case is that sexual difference is fundamentally the dispositive cause, so the thing that disposes us to the intellectual operation, so to the life of reason, to rationality, and ultimately to divine worship. Only because humanity comes bifurcated and twofold can you have the existence, or rather can you have the necessary conditions for the awakening of the specifically intellectual operation, which views the world as never simply given to a particular drive, never simply consumed, never simply an animal environment, but always open to another perspective, always open to another view, always referable to from the perspective of another. So sexual difference is this dispositive cause of the intellectual operation. This is something that is tangentially in Aquinas. And when we get to heaven, I believe that our sexual organs will more properly indicate that difference as such, than it will its subordination to the need for reproduction, right? So it's not that it's not like we will be ignorant of them having like also a reproductive function in the past, like they are what they are precisely as reproductive organs. This is not extrinsic to them. But for the human person, the way that he reproduces is also the way that he is divided in such a manner as to be capable of a world rather than an environment, to be capable of the objects of creation appearing to him as intellectual objects, as opposed to merely the objects of an animal drive. So it seems to me that in the glorified body, sexual difference will speak to each other of the gift, the profound gift of being invited into divine worship and being invited into the beatific vision. So we'll look down, as it were, and worship God, because we'll say, isn't it marvelous? Isn't it so wonderful that we are incomplete in ourselves in such a way that we are open towards the other?
Yeah. So another, I guess, kind of simpler way of looking at it is, what are our sex organs for? If it's just for reproduction, then they make no sense later on, except, again, like as soon as you have a Catholic worldview and a Catholic culture, what do you make of the religious, of the celibate person? Like their whole body has an orientation. Their entire body has a purpose, and they're not. Yeah, the vocation of a religious person is not like, I'm making this giant sacrifice so that I can be close to God. I mean, that's a part of it, but it's not the ultimate reason. It's living in a very like veiled and still difficult way, because it's earth.
Yeah.
The life of heaven now.
Yeah, like it would be silly to say that the religious are a group of people who simply negate a normal, natural, and good function of their bodies, and for whom that particular function is useless to them. because we are literally saying that the religious life is a more perfect life than the married life. It more appropriates to our redemption, or rather to our resurrection. And so what we should be saying, and what I try to say, is that they are sacrificing the subordination of sexual difference to the urgency of reproduction that happens after the fall, but they are actually living out in a more perfect way the meaning of sexual difference as such, which is to say they're living for the sake of divine worship. Yeah, so that's what I think about the resurrected body. I think it'll be more sexually differentiated in some ways, in the sense that its meaning will be more apparent. And he also asks, or this person also asks, is the gendered reality more of a source of earthly suffering or the opposite? And I think this is, in some ways, in our discussion of primal androgyny and the myths, it's like, the gendered reality is a source of suffering or the opposite, depending on what you make of it. like if you really want to be God, then
This
gendered reality is going to be a great source of suffering. If you really don't want to be God, so that you can be in love with God and enter into his life, then gendered reality is awesome, because it's precisely the primordial insufficiency that makes you the object of a gift of divine sufficiency.
Yeah, I think it highlights, too, our dependence on others for, like, happiness.
Yeah.
Andrew writes a lot about the common good being, like, friendship, a society of friends. Yeah, and if gender is a source of suffering, I mean, you could think of it as in within like your own gender category, like I don't fit into this. This could be a source of suffering, but also shows that like, yeah, you're really dependent on the other gender and how they respond to you in virtue or vice. That will make it an experience of suffering or an experience of joy.
Yeah, and it's weird for the Christian to ask the question, right? Because within the pagan world, suffering doesn't have a positive content. It's simply the lack of the good. But for the Christian, by suffering, we participate in the cross of Christ, by which we are redeemed. And so gender suffering becomes, like all suffering, capable of serving the goal of building the kingdom of heaven and ultimately attaining to eternal bliss with our neighbors. And I think you actually see this, right? Like you can see this in a very practical way when I don't know, maybe examples from my family aren't entirely appropriate, but it seems like when you start to have kids, then you take a lot of the suffering of the female within our world today, and you accentuate it in a certain respect, like things that, like you become less powerful vis-a-vis the man through pregnancy and childbirth. But at the same time, those sufferings then become meaningful in the sense that they obviously contribute to building up the common good in a profound way. Like they enable more love in the world. And so it seems to me like there's a pregnancy metaphor in the cross, obviously, where all suffering then becomes a route by which we enable more love in the world. We can offer up our sufferings and such.
Another point too is that it's in that space of tension that there is the possibility of love. So again, something else that Andrew writes about a lot is the example of the family. So like in the family, there is hierarchy. In our modern culture tends to say that like hierarchy is bad, but when you eradicate hierarchy in order to like achieve this equality so that no one is abused, you also lose the possibility of love and self-sacrifice and gift of the father. I mean, like what's happening in a relationship between the father and the son is the father is giving a gift to the son that the son cannot even comprehend. You can't have that level of like love or gift without hierarchy. It's in that very like tension, whereas there's the risk for greatest possible abuse, that you also have the risk, the space for the greatest possible love. And I think that's true also of gender. It's one of the places where there's the risk of greatest possible abuse and
totally.
also the place of greatest possible love.
Yeah, because if women are just like men, they're kind of easy to love just like men, you know, or hate just like men. But if they're very, very different, then you open up a possibility of a more profound love, and obviously vice versa. Well, maybe we should say this last question because it's the big one. Are souls gendered?
Da, da, da.
Capital R, capital souls, capital gendered. Do we have any from the live chat so we can
From
avoid
the
this one?
chat.
Somebody, Benjamin Boyce is in the chat. I don't know if you want to say hi
What's
to him.
up?
Hey.
Benjamin with Benjamin. We could rename your podcast right now, bro. Benjamin with Benjamin.
You want to look
That's
down that camera and say that?
Benjamin with Benjamin. Or rather, that's a podcast for people that have been on the Benjamin Boyce show. You know what I'm saying? Because they've been jamming
Yeah.
with Benjamin.
Yeah,
So it's
we
like
got, we got the joke.
Okay, gotcha. Anyways, we'll
Another
stop
name I can't pronounce that starts with an A was asking for clarification on the purpose of genitals in heaven and whether that's the allowance for the intellectual difference.
That's the next series, right?
Yeah, I mean it's mostly the next. It's the next series. Like I can try to do this in sort of short ways, but I am very aware that they are going to be inadequate to like
You're gonna find a lot of holes because you
Stay
can't.
tuned.
a long patient thing. But it's not going to stop me from trying one more time. So what I
Go for it.
Aquinas says, and I think he's right, that the reason that our bodies are the bodies they are is because of our ultimate end. And our ultimate end is divine worship, right? And the end of the human person considered as a animal who is different than other animals is obviously rationality, which he calls the intellectual operation. So his point is, if we want to ask why is something different than other things, we have to say, what is that thing for? And then that forness explains the difference. Okay, a plant is not like an animal because a plant is for the sake of the production of fruit. An animal is for the sake of its end is mobility, things like that. Okay, not the usual metaphysics that moderns are used to. But that's sort of where I'm coming from. So given that the end of the human person is the intellectual operation, he then Aquinas uses this to describe why, for instance, our hands are the way our hands are. So with the hand, he says, you'll notice that unlike the animals whose hands are designated to a particular operation, the hands of the human are infinitely malleable, precisely because in the intellectual operation, he's able to conceive of an infinite number of objects. Like there's nothing that cannot be the object of the intellect. I mean, for Aquinas, the intellect is just the pure potency to, well, I shouldn't say
And
the pure
it's
potency.
not like he's arguing like there could have only been one shape for a hand, but this is obviously what this hand is shaped for.
Yeah, I mean, I
Right?
think he does actually argue
Oh, does he?
well, it's the only shape. Given that I'll say this. So he also says this about the skin. So he says our skin is for the sake of the intellectual operation because it's, he says, the most temperate. Okay, so it's not too hot, it's not too cold. It is most able to sense the world, and it's for the sake of serving the intellectual operation. And if you read just these parts, you might come away thinking like, oh, Aquinas thinks that these two things are the human things, soft skin and hands. But obviously that's not the case. Like obviously if the soul is the form of the body, and if we have an intellectual soul, then it means that every single part of our body is the way it is precisely to dispose us towards the end of the soul, which is the intellectual operation. And so that has to be true on some level with sexual difference. Sexual difference cannot just be like a irrational animal thing plugged onto an otherwise rational animal. It itself has to be the kind of sexual difference it is to dispose us towards the end of the human person. You don't get the human person without being disposed to the particular human end, which is the intellectual operation, right? So sexual difference is the way it is. And he even goes through this like thought experiment, which is why I pushed back a little on your objection, because I remembered this thought experiment for Aquinas where he said, well, what if you gave a wolf the end of the intellectual operation? And he says, well, the wolf's body, by virtue of being given that end, would change into what we would recognize as a human body.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah. So Yeah. So when you get to then the question of our sexual difference, it's interesting because most people will, I think, acknowledge this about other parts of the body, but then suddenly this becomes this like locus of a animal nature world that's sort of detached from the spiritual ends of the human person, which is I think odd. Now it's my argument, generally speaking, that what sexual difference does is it provides the answer to this great mystery of the origins of consciousness. Not to take away consciousness as a mystery, but to show, well, I won't get into too many distinctions, but basically you have this problem, right, where every person who becomes awakened in their rational faculty is awakened by another person. Well, we know this. If you just leave a child alone in the woods, they die, or they develop into what really does look like a animal state, like they do not have the rational faculty, or they have an extremely damaged version of it. And you can say in potency, obviously, that they are a rational animal, but it's not activated, which is precisely what I'm saying. Like the human person is that kind of person whose fundamental end needs to be activated by another person, usually by the mother. And people have made great poetry of this fact. Like Balthazar talks about the smile of the mother being the thing that awakens the child into his rationality, into consciousness. Okay, but this is a huge problem because it's the first mover problem just applied to human beings, right? Because if everyone who has consciousness has it activated by another, then where did consciousness come from? You can't make an infinite regress, right? So there has to be a first mover. There has to be some consciousness that does not itself need to be awakened by another consciousness. And this is a mystery, and I don't want to take away from the argument, which I think seems to make sense to me, that this is a good apologetic for God. That in some ways, when we talk about like the original creation of the original man and woman and the infusion of divine wisdom into both the male and the female, that we are talking about the origins of consciousness. But I just also think that sexual difference as such is necessary to humanity in to receive that gift of consciousness. Why? Because Illich at some point says, he has this kind of throwaway line where he says, the gendered world teaches that there are always two perspectives, right?
Yeah.
And I think this says more than it means to, in that the animal world can be best described as a world in which there's always one perspective on a thing, okay? And maybe it's a great many one perspectives, but it's a drives and then objects corresponding to that drive, right? So like the human person can eat the peach, or he can paint the peach, or he can smash the peach into his friend's head, right? And he has that object sort of detached from just one possible view. Whereas within the animal world, we see this, that like the hungry animal eats the peach. The animal with this drive does that with the peach. Maybe the monkey throws the peach or whatever. But you have a limitation. They don't have the kind of freedom vis-a-vis the world. I mean, everyone, Heidegger, Freud, Aristotle, explains something like this, where you have what makes man man is his rational capacity, but this is always understood as a freedom from the animal capacity, animal environment in which you're limited by a particular drive to a particular view of a particular object, right? So this is in Aquinas too, in regards to the sensitive appetite. So sexual difference, I think, is the dispositive cause of the intellectual operation, in that it, in a most fitting and perfect way, provides a view of another who has a different perspective, not a modification of a more fundamental reality, as we've discussed with the animal species, but as a unique and distinct creation. So everything in the world is not limited to my one perspective on it. Everything in the world, by virtue of man being created male and female, is always, I'm going to use a postmodern thing here, always already open to the other perspective. And it's only in the meeting of those, it's only in the sort of negation of my one perspective as the only perspective that you are disposed as an animal to transcend the animal into the rational. Without it, I think that all you can describe the human being as is like a hyper animal, like something that's just got more drives and more abilities to use them, which I think we do sometimes. And I think that the actual way in which we're sexually differentiated, the reason it looks the way it looks even is because it tends us towards the opening up of two perspectives as opposed to one. So the reason we don't have fur, for instance, the reason that when we stand upright naked, our genitalia are like the reason we stand up naked, we don't stand up naked. The reason we stand up, so everyone makes this big deal of, man is the animal who has an upright gait, and the fathers talk about it as being because he's, high in the cosmos, and he's a sort of mediator between the earth and the sky in some way. Yeah, it is a symbolic. But what it also does is it reveals him in his sexual difference to the other, in his upright gait, in a way that for animals with what's called periodic sexuality, their sexuality becomes apparent precisely in its use.
Oh, yeah.
And, of course, there's lots of distinctions, lots of different animals to talk about here, and I think we can talk about them all. We're not going to. But my argument is basically that the way man is sexually differentiated enables him to see the world as being bifurcated between not just his perspective. And this is why consciousness has this sense of being lifted up out of the animal life. Like it has this sense of being saved, as it were, from animal drive.
And just to tack something on the end to make a bridge between that and what we were talking about earlier about sexual difference being for the worship of God, it's through the intellectual operation that we're able to enter into the life of the Trinity because we can know Him. Yeah, so I'm partial to what you've been talking about because it reveals a primary dependence on the other in order to enter into community with God, and that just seems to fit the whole pattern.
Yeah, I think to be human and to be insufficient unto oneself has a structural identity. Like those two things are in some way to say the same thing. And I think consciousness doesn't make any sense if you are sufficient unto yourself. But that's what we're not talking about. Not one bit. That's for next season.
Stay tuned.
Big spoiler. That's all that was. Got any more for us, or should we plow through some of these?
You should go with these pre-written ones.
Okay, what principles... Okay, we did that one. Since there's no turning back...
Is this 3 and 4?
I'm looking at 2B.
I don't think you've done 2B.
Yeah.
2B.
Since there is no turning back to what was before, do you think there is a way forward towards a gendered world of a new kind?
Yes.
The famous Gender Equality Paradox documentary reveals that the more government pushes the equality button, like in Scandinavia, the more gender exclusive certain occupations become, like nurses, construction workers, etc. Could this paradoxically be the way?
That's a great question.
Yeah, I mean,
I mean, if we're thinking about construction in general and what that means for human beings, we can only work with what's given. So whatever is going to come next is not going to be the same thing as what we had before, inevitably. Yeah, I don't know what that means, but I think that there is a movement towards. I mean, there's always movements towards new and different constructions.
Yeah.
And you see them even down to the level of the family. Like I remember when I was like babysitting in high school, and it's just one of the most fascinating things to me was going to the different people's houses, and you walk in and like you walk into a different world. Like you really walk into a different world. Like the whole rhythm of the household is different. Like the fundamental smells of the household are different. What's normal for the kids to do, for the parents to do is different. So we're always like constructing new gendered worlds, like with each new family.
Yeah. It seems like the creating gender exclusivity through trying to create more gender equality.
Well, I wonder if this is kind of like giving
scary.
women space and a room.
Well,
like
that's a very positive interpretation of Scandinavia.
But in something like if everyone has the opportunity to go to college and then people just kind of do what they want and women tend to go towards nursing.
Sure.
And men tend to go towards
Yeah, okay. I see.
engineering. That's kind of like a natural formation. Like you're giving like women mobility, and what do? They want to be together. Like they do things that they
Yeah.
want to do together.
Yeah.
It is a positive
No, you're right.
take, and
You're
I
right.
think it is a paradox, and it'll be really interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally distributing power, domain, and authority between people means that they can, within a society that's tending towards virtue, do what is sort of natural to them, what appears. There's this awesome line in the book of Samuel where Samuel says to Saul, he's just been anointed king, and then he says, "Do whatever you want because the Lord is with you." And it's a really awesome thought. It's like the most freeing thought. It's like, oh, if the Lord is with you, I get to do whatever I want, which is precisely what, like Augustine says when he says love and do whatever you want. And it's precisely what liberalism wants to say when they say do whatever you want, but they have no God. So it becomes insane, and you end up doing not what you want.
Yeah.
But, it does seem like if we are going to have any kind of gendered world, it can only be through freedom. Like you cannot coerce this thing into being.
Yeah.
You cannot centrally plan it. I think that's your point with it rising up and out of families. I think what liberalism is actually doing is centrally planning a gendered world. It's just pretending that it's not. So the gendered world it makes is one in which women have to compete with men. That's what being a woman means. That's what being a man is. It's centrally organized and enforced.
Constructing an androgynous world.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like it purports to be constructing a neutral world.
Right, but that's always the lie. It's just a kind of gender. It's a kind of doing of gender. It's a liberal kind. And so it seems to me like anything that has that kind of, any kind of attempt at creating any kind of gendered world that doesn't come from an increase in freedom in particular families, but a decrease in freedom seems to be doubtful to me. Okay, we read the other one. We got a C.S. Lewis quote given to us.
Yeah, should we do this one?
You want to read it?
Me?
Can you read all the words?
I think
Sorry,
so.
that's just to be clear.
Gender roles.
There are some tough ones in here because they're made up words.
It's from Perelandra. So this is C.S. Lewis's space trilogy, which I love.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
So this person sent in this quote. Wow, it's very long. Yeah, I'll just read it. Should I give the context?
The context is that it's a new world.
Yes.
Technically Venus, right?
Yes.
Called
Yes.
Perelandra, in which there's a sort of parallel Eden happening where there's an original man and woman, and there's an onlooker. His name's Ransom, and he's come to this world by spaceship, I think.
I think so.
I think that's all you need to know, right?
Yeah. So and then he's
Yeah, it's not
describing.
spaceship.
This is right after. This is the end. So this is right after. Well, I don't want to spoil the book, so I won't
Don't,
say.
yeah,
but I think
this
that's
is at the end, which would add some context.
Gotcha.
Oh. Yeah, so he's seeing both the Eve figure and the Adam figure?
So
No.
this is the first time he's seen the Adam figure with the Eve figure.
Okay.
He's seen the king with the queen, is the words Lewis uses.
Okay.
This is the first time he's seeing them together.
Oh, but it's not.
I think that's sufficient for
Okay,
the
it's
casual
fine.
listener.
It's fine. Both the bodies were naked, and both were free from any sexual characteristics, either primary or secondary. That one would have expected. But whence came this curious difference between them? He found that he could point to no single feature wherein the difference resided, yet it was impossible to ignore. One could try, Ransom has tried 100 times, to put it into words. He had said that Malacandra was like rhythm and Perelandra like melody. He has said that Malacandra affected him like a quantitative, Perelandra like an accentual meter. He thinks that the first held in his hand something like a spear, but the hands of the other were open, with the palms towards him. But I don't know that any of these attempts has helped me much. At all events, what Ransom saw at that moment was the real meaning of gender. Everyone must sometimes have wondered why, in nearly all tongues, certain inanimate objects are masculine and others feminine. What is masculine about a mountain, or feminine about certain trees? Ransom has cured me of believing that this is purely morphological phenomenon, depending on the form of the word. Still less is gender an imaginative extension of sex. Our ancestors did not make mountains masculine because they projected male characteristics onto them. The real process is the reverse. Gender is a reality, and a more fundamental reality than sex. Sex is, in fact, merely the adaptation to organic life of a fundamental polarity which divides all created beings. Female sex is simply one of the things that have feminine gender. There are many others, and masculine and feminine meet us on planes of reality where male and female would simply be meaningless. Masculine is not attenuated male, nor feminine attenuated female. On the contrary, the male and female of organic creatures are rather faint and blurred reflections of masculine and feminine. Their reproductive functions, their differences in strength and size, partly exhibit, but partly also confuse and misrepresent the real polarity. All this Ransom saw, as it were, with his own eyes. The two white creatures were sexless, but he of Malacandra was masculine, not male. She of Paralandra was feminine, not female. Malacandra seemed to him to have the look of one standing armed at the ramparts of his own remote archaic world, in ceaseless vigilance, his eyes ever roaming the earthward horizon whence his danger came long ago. A sailor's look, Ransom once said to me. You know, eyes that are impregnated with distance. But the eyes of Paralandra were opened, as it were, inward, as if they were the curtain gateway to a world of waves and murmurings and wandering airs, of life that rocked in winds and splashed on mossy stones and descended as the dew and arose sunward in thin-spun delicacy of mist. On Mars the very forests are of stone, and Venus the land swim. So I think he's encountering like the spirit of the planets.
Yeah, I thought it was a different quote. So this Paralandra is Venus. He's encountering the spirit that watches over the two planets, because the first book he goes to Mars, and Mars is Malacandra.
That makes more sense.
And it's an older world, so that's the quote there, the ever vigilant.
Gotcha.
So the way that Lewis is talking about masculine and feminine is that these are the more like real fundamental realities. They're the basic polarities of the created world, and this is like also manifested in male and female, but in more like obscure ways, is basically his take. It's very poetic, very beautiful. I mean, this seems to me like the basic pagan symbolic outlook of masculine and feminine.
I don't know. I don't like it. I want to like it, but I don't. And I think maybe because I thought it was like an Adam and Eve description, maybe if we're talking about spirits, then I guess I don't necessarily know.
They're like the king angels. I forget how the it's been a couple years, but I forget how the exact cosmology works, but these are like the leaders.
Just because we're doing a sort of philosophical thing and not literary analysis, I'm going to say, okay, like this is what I have to say about what I think is an idea, as if we're talking about the meaning of male and female, the meaning of gender.
So I think this is really compelling and it would resolve a lot of our questions very easily. Yes. Oh, there's this like more fundamental polarity reality that's out there. And then we're just iterations of it. And since we can't grasp the whole of the mystery, then it makes sense why we're confused all the time.
Sure, totally.
And it's compelling. It's very beautiful. But yeah, I also take issue with it, but I see what he's going for.
I mean, I think that the question I have is if the masculine and the feminine are more fundamental than the male and the female, and that the male and the female are like a cipher or like a instantiation in some limited way to this. I mean, I can only think of it as like a Platonic ideal polarity. Then why is it, I mean, this sounds like Butler, but why is it figured as masculine and feminine? Which is to say, it has within it the idea of sex. And I know that he wants to say that it's the reverse. But I don't see how this accounts for difference in cultural ascriptions of masculinity and femininity to the various parts of the world. It's like he uses the
mountain.
mountain,
certain trees.
right? But the idea that, I mean, it seems like that would hinge on mountains in every culture appearing as masculine, which they don't. And maybe you could say, well, yeah. So it seems to me that the idea that he rejects, which is still less is gender, an imaginative extension of sex, is probably closer to the idea, at least I think, accept, which is that what is the fundamental polarity that we experience first is sexual difference. I mean, I think the Freudians are right about this, actually. And so when we experience polarity in the universe, in creation, I think we have to experience it as for us. Like it's for us, as we are the human beings are the point at which the universe becomes conscious of itself. And so when the mountain is known, it's known in and through the human.
Yeah, it's known in and through the human mode. Yeah, and if we go back to the idea of the language of creation, if creation is a book, it's meant to be read, and it's meant to be read by human eyes. Yeah. And it's our mode of existence that's going to influence and color our interpretation of things. So I don't think that mountains are fundamentally masculine or feminine, but when we approach the world, we do it through gendered eyes. Yeah. And we like come up with like beautiful poetic constructions and languages and like symbolic like cultures and communication on top of that, using those things and integrating it into our fundamental experience.
Yeah, and in some ways this is Illich's point, right, is that we do sexually divide the world, but I don't think it's true that the world sexually divides us. So what I mean is, like, what Illich points to is that the reason that these things have certain names is because they belonged properly in some cultural manner to a people's men versus a people's women. So the origin of linguistic gender is in fact real gender distinctions, but culturally contingent ones. Mm-hmm. And that to me explains the phenomenon, which is that men and women used certain tools, did certain things, had certain places in an intricate dance of incommunicable difference, and that this actually associated, up until the rise of modernity, certain places, people, and things with the gender in a way that's inextricable to the construct that a particular society would live in.
Yeah. And we also, I think, approach the created world and like use its like symbolic value in order to communicate with each other, right? So if you're in a culture and you have like water as the symbol of woman, what are you doing? Like you're communicating to you and your community kind of the meaning and role of women and how you understand women in that community, which is like a source of life, something beautiful and mysterious, something also chaotic, possibly deadly.
Something that can kill you if you fall into it at night. Yeah, totally. And I have this experience, I don't know if you've had this experience, where we're so we see polarity through gendered eyes. I do think that he's right, that C.S. Lewis is right, that there is something that is common to polarities in nature and then the gender polarity in the person. But I think it's the book of Genesis that's actually informing his unity, the unity he's making here, because both are signs of the creatureliness of the thing in question. So the sun and moon are not polarities because they're masculine and feminine. Rather, the sun and moon are polarity because they're created as a real symbol of the authority and absolute sovereignty of God. Because when you see the moon as not the sun, and the sun is not the moon, but as being in relation with each other, then our minds posit a creator of both, because to experience limited domains is to ask for what limitless domain established them. To experience things that are restricted it's just a deduction, as it were, of the infinite from an experience of the finite. And a great way to show that something is finite is to make it in two, make it a polarity, make it something that bumps up against something else and can't be separated from that. I mean, that's what the book of Sirach says. He says, look at on the works of the Lord, how they are all in twos.
Yeah, and I think that like there's a reason why creation lays itself out so often in polarities. This is not accidental, because in order to communicate something of the divine, because all of creation is a reflection of the divine, one thing cannot capture the infinity that is God. And so one of the modes that displays that best is when you have like two extremes of the same thing. So like light and dark, hot and cold. I mean, polarity was a really big deal for like ancient Greek philosophy, and I think for good reason. And then when God reveals himself most fully in Jesus Christ, like we learn that God himself is this paradox of total justice, but also total love and mercy. He's infinite, changing, dynamic, but he also is the Lord of the law and who does not change. And so by our encounter with polarities, we're encountering something of the nature of God, and it's revealing things to us. And it is, I think, fitting then that human nature, which is supposed to image God, would also fall into that same pattern of polarity. Not because like there's like this like fundamental oppositeness, like man is not the opposite of woman, and vice versa, but this like experience of tension, of like seeming opposites, is a part of our imaging of God as well, in the same pattern with the rest of the universe. And I think that's what makes this passage so beautiful and appealing.
Yeah, but like whenever you think
to polarity,
you think of a polarity in our culture, whatever that may be, I think you also have the male-female interpretation of it, and the one that I think of is cats and dogs. And I'll die on this hill. All cats are girls unless proven otherwise, and all dogs are boys unless proven otherwise. And the reason is not because of anything about cats and dogs in themselves, but precisely because for other reasons, contingent, arbitrary even, cats and dogs are a polarity in our culture. If cats and dogs were not a polarity, like, for instance, I don't think you have the same experience in comparison cats and turtles, because no one has placed them, as far as I know, in a polarity. But since cats and dogs are, then our primary experience of polarity, which is the sign of the goodness of us being creatures, of us not being God, I do think is the lens through which we see the cat and the dog.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to my earlier point about how that's like a cultural mode of communication.
Yeah.
Like we are not really like as big into like water imagery and creation imagery now, but cats and dogs are a thing, and it speaks to us something about how the sexes fundamentally relate and what they are like. We could have constructed it otherwise. It's what we're using to communicate with ourselves. It's the images that we're using to express how we understand male and female.
Yeah. All right. There it
also,
is. C.S. Lewis.
Man, the line, the eyes that are impregnated with distance, that was just really beautiful.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
He's an amazing writer. Anyway.
All right. Any more from the live chat?
I don't. Wow. Benjamin wants to know which gender is to blame for your fashion sense.
It's a tough one. I have to do some psychoanalysis here. It was women. They did this to me.
That's correct.
I had to think back to like my castration complex, and then how that created a subject, me, and then why that subject wears the shorts he wears.
I mean, it's,
It's all really quite clearly written out when you take a moment to think of it. Fashion sense is interesting because that's probably the place in which we most experience like male-female difference and its exchange with each other as like the way to mark the cultural change from one to the other, which is why men at some point wore tights, for instance.
That's right. I'm glad
That's
not
all
a
I have to
thing.
say about that. The gender problem. I wanted to get Mark to unpack how we should engage the true believers of the gender stuff. His critiques of the left-right argument here make a lot of sense. The strict materialism of conservatives is inadequate. Thank you. I think so too. But short of "this is why Catholicism is the best," an argument that works well in my head, but often dead on arrival among the petit bourgeois types that buy into it. Yeah. I mean, the argument. I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. I don't know how to engage the true believers of the gender stuff, and in speaking with them, I tend to just try and listen and figure out some common ground, because it doesn't seem like a lot of the premises are being shared. So one of the big things that I've found to be effective is to, at the very least, get rid of the aesthetic of rebellion, which seems to be a bigger often a bigger motivation than gender dysphoria, which is definitely a real thing that happens to people. But I think that part of what I've found helpful is to try to discern with someone, is the joy of your non-binary identification in fact from a sort of interior authenticity by which you are becoming the person that you want to be and in tune with who you really are? Or is it in fact that you live in a world in which the only heroes and the only values go to those who can show that they are throwing off some constraint of a social system, of something prior, and asserting themselves as individuals over and against a society that would keep them down? Because if you're doing that, and I understand it's very tempting, and it infects everything, and we just love it, and Catholics do it too, you know, like there's no more convincing argument for the church than that. It like, what I mean is, it seems to me sometimes that there's no more convincing argument for the church than when you can describe it as like somehow being edgy and, like a rebel within a world that's conforming or whatever, which is paradoxical, right? Because the real rebellion becomes being willing to conform to something that you love in earnest, and getting out entirely of the game, by which you always have to have some kind of enemy that you're destroying in order to have value within yourself. So walking that through with people is good. I mean, one of the things that I think is that a lot of this actually has to do with abortion, and sometimes acknowledging that helps open up a new framework for thought for people. Because when you think about it, we live in a society that kills the children it doesn't want, and often very deliberately on the basis of bodies, so like, a Down syndrome's test or something like this. And this creates, as it creates for all sacrificial regimes, whether pagan or modern, it creates the appearance that everyone who survives abortion, everyone who survives this initial threat of death, has been chosen. You're the chosen people, right? So we have this phrase, for instance, within the promotion of abortion: every child a wanted child, right? Like, this is the desire of the pro-abortion movement, is that every child becomes a wanted child. But this is a crisis. This is a massive psychological crisis, because if every child is supposed to be a wanted child, then my continued existence now is always going to be beset with the anxiety of whether I am still wanted. Like, if we're trying to produce only wanted people, then my value hinges upon a human decision that I am wanted, quite literally on my parents deciding that I am wanted and therefore not aborting me. But then continuously that value relates to that initial, or to a human decision. And what I think this does in our society is it creates a real fear of the given body over the chosen body, because it's precisely the chosen body that survived the sacrifice of abortion, and it was the given body that was held up as possibly to be executed, right? So it's like, and what I mean is, the given body is the body that's just appears. It's there in the maternal womb. It is what it is. God, I mean, you could say it's what God made, is how we would think of it. But I think in a general sense, it's the one that you let surprise you, and that you don't, it's not an object of your choice. It's like a gift, right? And the chosen body is the one that you hold up to the light of some human ideal, So is it healthy? Okay, then I won't kill it. Does it fit with my plans for college? Okay, I won't kill it. Is it from the man I want? Then I won't kill it. Is it from the kind of sexual act that I want? Then I won't kill it. Is it from, you just go on, but basically you have some human law, essentially, some legal code, which you say, if it meets these conditions, it shall live. Well, I think puberty especially inaugurates a crisis in this kind of people, like a people who have been reduced to a purely wanted people, which is suddenly the body, which was chosen, which was wanted, reasserts itself as a given body. It's doing stuff. It's saying, whatever your plans were, I'm growing hair, and So I think there's a profound intuition. Maybe I wouldn't call it intuition, but there's a profound problem at puberty that isn't just reducible to like, we're scared of, onset menstruation or something, which is scary enough, I presume. But it is the reassertion that the body it needs to be chosen again, as it were. Like you need to relive the crisis that abortion inaugurates. You need to say, okay, I am here because I survived the threat of death by meeting a human ideal. Do I still meet it? Can I still meet it again? And so a lot of the times what it seems like we're doing when we're turning on our body in disgust or otherwise having this profound sense that we are in the wrong body is because we know that the body needs to be the object of choice in order to survive, in order to belong to the regime of abortion. And so often this, I believe, and I'm not going to go through the stats here, but I believe this is often the source of self-abuse, self-harm, cutting, starving oneself, burning oneself, things like that you actually try to kind of relive the original trauma of abortion precisely in order to survive it, right? Precisely in order to treat the body as the object of a possible death that you then survive. So then you've repeated the original moment at which your life was deemed to be valuable. And in a similar way, I think a lot of us are going through this when it comes to sexual difference. That if we can reconstrue our bodies as chosen, then those bodies become more appropriate for the abortion regime. Like we're more secured in it because we chose it. We're more assured of our survival, and sometimes I think that the reason, well, yeah, I'll leave it there. So I think that this opens up a new perspective because we know that transgenderism has this high association with self-harm, high association with depression, and we can argue a lot, I guess, about why that's the case, and especially in any particular instance. I don't mean to judge, but it does seem like the fact that we are a society in which the people who are living face an initial threat of death and then survive it by virtue of being chosen and approximated or matching up to a human ideal means that this is our origin story, this is our founding myth, and we'll have to relive it in order to be affirmed in our worth and our existence and our value later on. So I think that sometimes we think of transgenderism as just this like crazy thing that kind of happens because we're confused about biology or about like I don't know. But what I'm arguing is that I think it actually makes a lot of sense in order to get peace within a regime of child sacrifice, that we would undergo these sorts of crises and resolutions wherein a given body is mutated into a chosen body. Is that sort of, I mean, I know I've talked to you about this before, but that's sort of something that I found at least opens up a new perspective. So we're not just talking about like, don't you think that, I don't know, I wouldn't even know how to have a discussion on just like defending gender to someone that thinks that it's
yeah, I guess the problem that I've run into, it's like the argument is this mountain that reaches this conclusion at the top, but in order to get there you have to have a lot of foundational principles that you have to agree upon.
Yeah.
And most people haven't thought them through, haven't known about them, don't see how they're connected. They don't see that by accepting this premise, I'm also accepting this giant worldview down here that maybe I wouldn't actually want to be a part of, like kind of the like queer theory. I don't think is what people think it is.
Yeah, totally.
Like, or at least like the most like honest and intellectually rigorous kind.
Yeah.
I think people don't realize that their conclusions about like the malleability of sex and gender means that this has to be the case, this worldview.
Yeah.
So I think for me, the movement where I would go is to start making those connections. Like, okay, well, if that's the case, like, well, I mostly talk about Butler because it's what I know. And kind of drawing out the conclusions and the worldview that comes from this specific belief.
Yeah.
Yeah, ideas have consequences, and you really need to know what are the consequences of your ideas, and this is a big deal. And I think that can be the opening for a shift in perspective. I mean, my goal in those conversations is never to convince the other person, because that's not going to happen in an instant.
Sure.
Ever. But I think typically my goal is just to show how it's a part of a much wider pattern than probably what they're imagining, and just talk about that, and then present myself, or at least like my perspective, is something that's reasonable. Not that I have to win, but just show that there's another reasonable perspective. And then also to affirm the things that they are seeing, because I think it's really unhelpful when you approach someone like that and just say, no, you're seeing everything all wrong. Like, it just makes them, you're basically calling them insane, which is not true. You can believe like insane things and not be an insane person. You've just accepted certain things that have led you to these other conclusions. So like pointing out like the thing that they're rebelling against, like the bad thing that they're rebelling against, like, yeah, this is good. Or I remember in one conversation I was having was like pointing out that, yeah, for like Protestant America, what it means to be a woman is like fundamentally tied to like marriage, family, having children. This is what your body is for, and if you don't exercise it in that way, then it's kind of unintelligible. You're right in rebelling against that. You're right in that making you feel uncomfortable, because you have this intuition that you are for something more than just the use of your body, and I think that can be really helpful too.
Yeah. And the greatest success that I've ever had in these conversations, especially with trans people, is to ask them. I mean, this is like cheap because it's political, but sometimes it opens the door to discussing metaphysics or discussing philosophy on a deeper level. But is to just ask, like, do you like capitalism? And usually they're like, no, I hate capitalism. I'm like, okay, which do you think is a more appropriate subject of capitalism? A gender fluid person or a sexually differentiated person? And then just having that discussion. And it's not hard to convince someone that obviously the gender fluid person is way more responsive to the demands of capital, because they quite literally need capital in order to attain an identity of any sort, whereas sexual differentiation is, at least as far as the Catholic Church is concerned, is from God, and so has this certain resistance to being used for the sake of money. And it's not an answer. It's not like, now your gender dysphoria is solved. But it does help. I think that people are so, because life is complicated, it moves fast, and we're all online and we're all talking, so it can become really easy to create these categories where you're like, okay, things I hate, capitalism, conservatives, Trump, the gender binary, and it all like becomes in this, it's just sort of like one bad thing, and then just being able to show, like, actually this thing that you think is bad resists this other thing you think is bad, and this thing you think is really good is actually extremely helpful to, say, corporate tyranny, which is why every major corporation has adopted it. Those things can be helpful, not for like solving the problem, but for at least opening the door to say, like, this isn't just a discussion. If we just have this discussion on this level, you're going to lead yourself to contradictions, but if we can just talk about what's true, then you can see a way out.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of the same thing, like immediately putting it to a broader context that's going to give you a new perspective.
Yeah.
I think that's a great way to approach things.
Okay, we got two more. Anything from the live chat, or should we just plow through here?
You should just go with those.
You
and then we'll
mention-
get to the rest if we have
Okay.
time.
You mentioned conversion to Catholicism is the only solution to the gender problem. We actually literally, how did they know that? We did that during the Q&A. That's
No,
amazing.
this-
You said it last time too.
Oh, cool. Can just mere Christianity solve this as opposed to Catholicism? Why is Catholicism uniquely capable of resolving this issue?
yeah, I think we've talked about.
Consecrated
yeah.
virginity, baby.
Yeah.
It is a sign that sexual difference is for the sake of divine worship, and it is a check against the idea that it can be reduced to the same thing that it means for animal species, namely the reproduction of the species that faces the threat of death. But there's obviously much more to say about that. And that really is, if you can't tell by now, the content of the second season that we're working on. Okay.
Last question.
I don't know if the shoots are going this way, but is there a preparation in gender ideology towards transhumanism? I feel like transhumanism is the final ideology as a total attempt of overriding God. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There's a great essay by Zizek. I think it's entitled "No Sex, Please, We're Transhumanists Now." That says as much. It's really very good. It's very funny, and I would recommend reading it. But I'm
Yeah.
sure we could say something more ourselves, or
Yeah, I mean, I think the insight is right. Both are like both are a bid for divinity, androgyny, and also transhumanism. Like we're trying to transcend our limited givedness in order to have greater control and power. Yeah, it's just an extension of the logic, and it makes sense that both movements are happening in our culture simultaneously.
yeah. I mean, the only difference between like transhumanists and like Egyptian occultists or like Gnostics in the early Christian church is that the transhumanists are way more boring and think that they're going to achieve it through like venture capitalism and drinking young people's blood. I guess that last part's exciting.
That is.
But but yeah, I mean, like another way of saying idolatry is transhumanism, because you can never within the real world as it's given, there is no such thing as transcending the human that is not an imitation of the divine. That's the only option. You don't get to transcend the human up unto the point of the cactus. It doesn't work like that. And so,
Did you say the cactus?
yeah, like the
Just
cactus is
you
not
mean
the
the
object of
cactoid?
transhumanism. The problem with the transhumanists is they don't want to admit it that they want to be gods. They want to say that we just want to be transhuman. It's like the post-liberals, right? They don't want to admit that they don't want to be liberals. They just want to be like beyond liberal. See, that was a self-diss. But in fact, the original transhumanists, of course, were Adam and Eve under the tree, when they desired to be like God, not as God invites them to participate in their weakness, but as self-sufficient divinities, as grasping divinity for themselves. And the idea that now we can do this technologically is, I think, also false. Rather, they were already trying to do it technologically under that tree in the garden. They were literally trying to have the material world ordered in such a way that it would produce divinity in its effects through the negation of sexual difference. And so the fact that we are now trying to do that more generally, or with just more capital, is unsurprising. But I would point out that it's always a greater slavery, right? Because where transhumanism is an ideal achieved by masses of capital, which I think you would probably need in order to, implement all the various microchips that you need in the body, then the ultimate production of transhumanist is the most dependent on other human beings for his existence as a god, which again is no surprise. It's precisely the story of the
Trickery.
Bible,
Yeah.
which is that wherever you create divinity, what you create is a profound dependence on others. Like you are only a god insofar as in some other aspect you are more and more a slave, which is why Augustine says that, in sin you vault towards the heavens, but you descend towards the beasts. It's a simultaneous motion in the idolatrous heart that you desire to be like God, and precisely because you desire to be like God, you have to become more like the animals in order to have a relation to creation that's one-sided, has a singular perspective, that orders everything unto yourself, that has a private domain, very much like a cat, for instance. Sexual difference saves us from being like cats, and that's why it's good.
And from being boring.
Yeah, because whenever we think we have the one perspective, it's ruptured. And to live within the ruptured perspective is, I think, to be human properly. And I don't want to transcend it. I don't. I think it's way too much fun. Yeah.
Well, unless there's any more questions.
Any more questions there, just say?
We have one more that came in earlier that I missed. Do you want to answer it real quick?
Sure.
Illich seems to not acknowledge the existence of grace and thus dismisses the church's influence on the gendered world. What is the church's role in constructing gender through the infusion of grace? I think you kind of answered this on the last Illich episode, but that last part's a little different.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think it's kind of a fun one to end on because it's kind of a more positive vision. I think that goes back to Galatians. Like the church is able to come in and to make judgments about the gendered world, not because she's saying like, oh, no, like you have to construct it this way. Here, move aside, let me move these pieces for you. She is there to judge whether or not there are the fruits of the Spirit. She's able to reveal to us the limits that we do have, right? Because oftentimes we just forget the limits that we do have. I mean, that's what the transhumanist movement is doing, like forgetting that humans have actual limitations. The church can reveal that and pointing out where we sin, and then also like infusing actual people with the grace that is necessary in order to live virtuous lives, which will inevitably be creative and will enhance that construction, giving us the possibility to be creative, the possibility to be humble in our limitations, but also the humility to like hold our creations with an open hand, to not just hold on to them tightly and absolutely so that they can't change at all. I think that's one of the aspects of a healthy family, I think, right? You have this constructed world and multiple levels, but if you have parents who are tightly holding on to their construction and there's no possibility of deviation or exception or like massive change in order to respond with your limitations or the environment, that's an unhealthy, uncreative, unhappy family. I think all those same things apply.
No, I think the first thing that the church does is it, by definition, breaks open the totality of the closed gendered world. So one thing that Illich points to, and he points to it positively, and I'm pointing to it negatively, is that gendered worlds can create a kind of closed off total system, because you have what men are supposed to do and you have what women are supposed to do, and then this is judged through honor and shame, what he calls probity, but it's basically judged not by any appeal to anything transcendent, any universal, but to tradition or history. Namely, this is what we've always done. And though I might sound like a liberal when I say it, I think that one of the marks of the church is liberation from tradition, where tradition is taken in the sense of a necessity that is closed off towards change. The church can judge gendered worlds because the church has the mind of Christ. And so it is it's a spiritual power at work, and it can say, like you pointed out, the fruits of the Spirit are not here, these are the works of the flesh. But what it always works to do is to restore human freedom to try again. So quite literally to forgive sins, so that we can try again. And in trying again, we have the ability to do it differently. So, okay, I'm going to be this type of father because when I tried to be that type of father, I had works of the flesh and not fruits of the Spirit result. And so in its constant reform of humanity, in the church as the reforming humanity, it judges gendered worlds precisely because it values them as what produces people who are virtuous, but also open to the divine.
To get back to your point about how the church is the liberation of tradition, I think maybe it'd be helpful that it's the liberation from a dead tradition.
Sure.
Like the church herself is a living tradition. It is organic and it grows and it flowers. So Yeah, she liberates us from constructions that are actually like constricting of real human experience and what it means to be human and to grow and to change. But at the same time, like she reminds us that what it means to be human is to be a part of a family, to be limited, to come from the place of what is given, that we are constrained by reality, even as that reality is living and is moving and is growing and is dynamic.
Totally, dude. All right, well, thank you all for listening to Season 1 of The Politics of Gender. We are very excited to come back with Season 2, where we'll be tackling all sorts of questions about intellect and the Book of Judith, some other things. It's going to be a lot of fun.
The Book of Judith is my favorite book of the
It's going to be
Bible.
awesome. There's your reading assignment for next time. We're going to come back with a season of Good Money. It'll be the next thing we do. Hopefully with some good soil in between.
Yeah, there's stuff in between, I think. I don't know.
Who knows what we'll do? It's our conference weekend next, so I can't even think of that. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. I hope you have a really great day. God bless you all. Goodbye. Goodbye.